covering the events in Ukraine quite closely. If you have a look in the nest, the second item from the right is a link to their space, which has either just concluded or is wrapping up. If you would like to listen to their recording, it should be at that link shortly, and they run at 2 p.m. Eastern Time every Sunday. So I'd encourage you to join them. I certainly do. Well, another resource that's up in the nest that you may be interested in is our community calendar, which I really appreciate is maintained by my frequent co-host, Jacoby. The idea there being that the Spaces search feature is not good at all, and there are a number of us who are holding conversations both about open source intelligence and the events in Ukraine. We wanted them all in one spot, and we thought if we were building a calendar, it would also be valuable to include outside events as well. So when there are talks by whether they be think tanks like the Atlantic Council or OSINT organizations, like there are Bellingcat seminars on there as well. So you can check that out. The individual entries should have links to whatever registration options there are for the events. If the event is passed, usually that same link will take you to a recording of it. And if you notice interesting events coming up that you think we should have on the calendar, we're not getting a lot of input on them, and that's fine, but we would love to have more to make sure we're not missing anything. You can either DM me or Jacoby, and we'll make sure they wind up on the calendar. We will hopefully a little later on be hearing from Andrew Perpetua, who is a past guest of ours. When he was on previously, we spoke with him at some length about his background and some of his processes that he goes through in developing his battlefront maps. Today he's going to drop by, but only for the purposes of giving us an update on the front. And so we'll get to that whenever he joins us. But to that end, up in the nest, the second item from the left is my tweet that just says Ukraine overview. Usually, the usual suspects are in here, including DEFMON and the Institute for the Study of War. I will highlight a few items. So for example, I will add to the nest one map that's done by Ukraine War Mapper that shows the estimated lines around Bakhmut, of course an area of considerable interest, and then contrast that with two items, one of which I'm putting up in the nest, is a tweet by the War Cube, and he has started to collect firms data, which, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a satellite that I believe, it's a US satellite, I believe NASA maintains it, that tracks infrared, signals or energy. Usually those are associated, hotspots of those are associated with fires, and so they have been used by those tracking the Ukraine war to look for areas of intense combat. And so you can see that his pickup of the last week's data from firms, he's highlighting the degree of difference between what he believes are potential Russian artillery positions and Ukrainian artillery positions, suggesting that there is much more infrared and therefore fire likely in the Russian positions. But I'm pointing this out for two reasons. The first is that firms is back. I had asked in a space probably about a month ago to say, I haven't seen any firms data coming out. Nobody's been using it for the last few weeks. I wonder why that is. And then, of course, regular speaker in our space, Misfit, pointed out he believed that the fires are just potentially less common in winter, and that also the infrared satellite may not pick up data as well in winter conditions, including that in that early spring period there was just more cloud cover. But so first of all, as a data gathering technique, it appears that access to firms is now a little more solid. The other is to contrast the firm's data versus the map put together by WarMapper, which seems to suggest that there may be Russian presence deeper into the center of Bakhmut than the WarMapper map suggests. And then I'll contrast that with one more item I'll highlight in the front of the nest, which is a tweet by Konrad Muzyka, who I think is one of the best analysts of the war. And he's noting a tweet from Chris Miller, who is a reporter for the Financial Times who lived in Bakhmut for many years. And he is identifying from a video. He's saying, wow, I know where this fighting is taking place. It's right in central Bakhmut. I used to live right here. And Muzyka is pointing out, well, if we're getting this testimony from somebody who lived there and saying it's in the center of the city, but the reports and maps suggest that they're still further on the eastern edge of the city, perhaps these reports aren't consistent, so maybe they're not completely up to date. So I highlight that just to say it's often best to gather your information from multiple sources, and that the maps are not always 100%. Just before going to Andrew, because I see he's joined us, I wanted to do a quick update on the projects of some of the guests that we've had in recent spaces. Some of these I think are really interesting. So the first of which should appear in the nest in just a moment, is a tweet from the Bald Geek, who we spoke with on Thursday evening about his flight tracking project, which is not, I won't call it brand new, because I think he's been working at it for a few years, but it seems like it's really taking off right now. And that includes an interesting map. For those who listened to the conversation, he can track those ACARS flight messages from geostationary satellites, low Earth orbit satellites, and radio. And this map is his coverage of receivers for the low Earth orbit satellites, which is the Iridium network. And he's welcoming a new data collector to his network, but that allowed him to put this map of coverage up, which I thought was interesting because I see that much of, for example, the east coast of Canada is not covered. And being a ham radio operator myself, based in Canada, even though my region is covered, so I couldn't contribute directly, now I'm inspired, for example, to reach out to some radio clubs in Quebec and the Maritime provinces to say, hey, here's this opportunity for you to use your radio skills to contribute to a project. Maybe you would be interested. And I pointed out because likewise, there are lots of regions in Alaska and regions in Mexico. If you have any skill with radio, or if you know people in those regions who might be interested, I just wanted to point it out to you so that we can keep building out those projects. One other follow-up message that I thought was interesting. There is a tweet in the nest. It's the first from Dimitri, who runs War Translated. And you wouldn't realize there's anything particularly interesting about this tweet, except for the fact that Stephen, who goes by the handle Stepan S, where Stepan is the letter 1, the T in Stepan is the number 1. He encouraged us to reach out to him with interesting examples for translation. And I know that several of the regulars here have done that. And this is one example. Just this morning, I came across this video that has been slowly making the rounds. And it's notable because it's 2 oligarchs who have considerable political influence in Russia, apparently privately recorded, where they're complaining, extreme complaining about the state of affairs in Russia and Putin in particular. And it's sort of an embarrassing but insightful moment. And it seemed to have only been circulating in Russian. So I sent it to Stephen this morning at 8 a.m. Eastern time, and then 5 or 6 hours later, Dmitry put out this translated and captioned version of the video, which is now getting thousands of retweets. So this is just an example of by connecting and finding ways that we can help people with their projects, it does make a difference. So I would encourage you to consider reaching out to Stephen or others on the War Translated team when you see items that are of interest to you. Also related, let's see here. I'm just putting 2 more items up in the nest. There were tweets put out by Oryx, who we all know as running the sort of premier list tracking the losses in the Ukraine war, both of the Ukrainians and the Russians. And there was a change in the availability of personnel on his team. I understand that the individual who was running sort of the consolidation of the list on a day-to-day basis, Jacob, who had been doing a terrific job for several months, he, I guess, had an injury that means he can't sit at his desk for hours in the way he had been. As a result, Oryx has taken over consolidating the list again by himself. But you'll see the tweet, it's the 3rd one back. He says, "I will take over updating the losses for a month, but if no permanent solution is found in that month, we'll kill off all the lists that are related to the Russo-Ukrainian war." And, this struck a chord with people because Oryx's lists have been so valuable. And this has inspired me. So after we hear from Andrew, I want to get into a bit of a philosophical discussion about what is the purpose of OSINT? How have these teams developed? I think other than some of our interviews with some of these interesting guests, a lot of people would have no idea how these teams and projects are run, that some of them are much smaller than you might imagine, considering the great work that they're doing, and what the transition, would need to be to make them sustainable. But to that end, Oryx, there was an outpouring of support, of course. And a lot of people suggested, oh, well, why don't you set up a Patreon? And his response was, we have one, all the money that goes to the Patreon, we donate to charity. And then he reiterated, as I put up in the nest again, I can't stress this enough, I don't want your money, please donate to charities instead. And so his concern isn't the funding. I think it's more about just getting help and assistance. And so he has lots of valuable people on his team. I was briefly in touch with Nalcio, who's a member of his team, and I see he's in the audience with us today. And we've interviewed Nalcio before about his role in the project. And Nalcio confirmed to me and said I could pass along that, don't worry, the lists will not be ended. There are members on the team willing to take it on. That partly it's an expression of frustration, but it certainly highlights, sort of the fragility of even a project like Oryx's that's regularly cited by, CNN, the BBC, all of the major media. And he regularly jokes about many of the Defense Department's intelligence agencies referring to his numbers indirectly, but often not quoting him and certainly not supporting him. So it just raises that broader question. I also put up a note by the account JD Work, who is an intelligence and sort of cyber expert. And he notes that the prospective loss of a major contributor, so he's referring to Oryx, is exactly the sort of instability in crowdsourced intelligence that demands dedicated investment by those for whom such questions are real priorities. And so we have seen that, for example, in the UK-based, I think it was the Integrated Review, they talked about building out OSINT capability, and there is an interesting article I'll get to a little bit later that likewise talks about the need for the US to invest more in it. And that partly, begs the question, should these organizations be building their systems from scratch, or are there existing pools of talent that can be tapped into, and how do we connect these groups? But that was the catch up on some projects we're working on. So it's great to see that the flight tracking project is proceeding. Please help them out. If you see anything interesting you'd like translated, don't hesitate to send it to War Translated or Stepan. And I was glad to hear the update from Nalcio that Oryx's lists will continue. They're just working on finding a solution. So with that, I'd love now to turn to chat again with Andrew, who has joined us, just to get an update on, maybe a little mini version of the excellent presentations that you're putting up on YouTube. How are you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing well, thank you. Most of the news that I have is artillery related. It's also kind of super interesting. on the battlefield itself, there haven't been super interesting developments too much recently.
Yeah, but I saw Defmon the other day. Several days now has said, really there's almost no update. So I'd imagine that's a challenge for you as well.
Yeah. Around Kupiansk, the situation is pretty stable. There haven't been many changes in like the past week and a half, 2 weeks. But most notably, Ukraine has hugely increased their artillery in around Kupiansk. They have like way more ammo, like way more ammo than they used to have. They've been using it mostly for counter battery fire. And I heard yesterday they had the most kills ever yesterday with their counter battery fire. I'm not sure exactly what that means. I mean, like, what does it mean? Like, did they kill the most guns ever, or I'm not really sure what that means. But that is what I've been reliably informed. The yesterday was the biggest day ever.
I've seen reports that I think it was the Kiev Independent saying their volume of fire had increased by 10 times, which sounds like a huge number.
Yeah, doing the math and having talked to a few people and doing the math, I think a 10 times increase is actually underselling it. It might be closer to a 15 times increase.
Well, I also had seen you comment over the course of several days. You were seeing reports that Ukraine had been doing extensive reconnaissance of Russian artillery positions, and you think they may be focusing on those?
Yeah, from what I understand, they've been very much focused on taking out their artillery. We have reports from all over. The Ukrainian sources that I have focus a lot around Kupiansk and how they have taken out like pretty much like all of the Russian artillery around Kupiansk, just targeting it, taking it out with because they have very significantly longer range than the Russian artillery. I think it's like maybe 50% further. So they can outgun and or at least outrange, and they have better accuracy. So they've just been just toasting the Russians around Kupiansk. But then the Russians are complaining that they've lost all of their artillery in like Zaporizhia. That they used to have like a lot of guns in around like Kopani and Rybitny and Razdori, and then also they used to have a lot of guns like near Lake Nikopol, where they had guns in like Enerhodar and Dubrovka and Kamyanka Tibrovska. And we very rarely get reports of shelling around Nikopol. There was some last night. And also that they've been taking out a lot of stuff on the Dnipro River near Kherson and all that too. So Ukraine has been, they've gone on a campaign where they are putting like all of their resources into hunting down and destroying Russian artillery all over the place. The one location where this may not be true is Avdiivka, and that there are other things going on there, namely the Russian air power. But Ukraine obviously has artillery there too. But you just I don't hear this sort of hunting behavior near Avdiivka. And also when you see Ukrainian forces around Avdiivka, like when Russians they post you know their drone kills with their little suicide drones. A lot of the things that they're hitting are towed guns and not self-propelled guns. So so Avdiivka might be the exception, but pretty much everywhere else, Ukraine is targeting and destroying Russian artillery.
So a moment ago, I referred to a tweet. I think it was the War Cube, who was pulling down the firm's data around Bakhmut, and it seemed like there was, way more apparent, fire from shelling on the Russian positions. Some people were arguing about, oh well, the positions the Russians are in on the edge of the city is more urban than are the Ukrainian artillery positions out at Chasiv Yar, which might account for some of the difference. But you think it may actually be just, is it potentially that it just is volume of fire difference that's being reflected in firms data?
Yes. We do have firms data from like the center of Bakhmut has been getting hit pretty hard. Like there's kind of like a little like a residential area like right in the center of Bakhmut that's been like just on fire the past few days. So I'm assuming that is largely from shelling. Um, from what I've heard, it's much more difficult for Russia to target the Ukrainian guns due to the shape of the terrain. It makes it harder for them to locate the guns using radar, just because like the shape of the hills and stuff. So Ukrainian guns can kind of hide behind these hills and shoot and then move, and then it's much harder for Russia to counter fire because just the shape of the terrain itself. So yesterday I heard the northern part of Chasiv Yar was shelled pretty heavily, and you could kind of see that on the firm's report as well, because the northern part of the city was had lots of fires, and I heard that was from artillery separately. So the firm shows fires, and then I know people who were there who said it was hit by shelling. So yeah, I don't know what else to say.
I presume you're anticipating that this, such a big increase in shelling is likely to be shaping operations in that by eliminating Russian artillery, it will increase the potential for Ukrainian mobility, if they begin an offensive in the coming weeks. Is that what's we're likely seeing?
It could be, or it could be that Ukraine has decided that this is just a better use of their resources, because you have very limited resources. So one option is to spread your resources out to be, very thin everywhere, or your other option is to put all your resources in a very small number of places. And right now, there's really four places in Ukraine. There's Kupiansk, there's Bakhmut, there's Avdiivka, and there's Vuhledar. So if you want to put all your resources in a very small number of places, you can throw them all in those four places, more or less. So whether this is a shaping operation or if it's just a more intelligent way to use finite resources, I guess we'll find out soon.
That's an interesting point. I would also wonder, and I'm not sure whether you're able to speak to this, but there was also the announcement this past week about the European Union creating a $2 billion ammo facility to supply Ukraine. So it may also be that with with greater confidence in sustained supply, they feel free to dig deeper into their stockpiles now than they did before. Okay. Allsource, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just had a follow-on question for Andrew based on this conversation he had, the comment he made about the concentration of combat power in some areas. And so Andrew, I guess, because again, I have some theories, but love your intake. do you think that one of the issues that the Russians have in their offensive operation in Ukraine is that for them to achieve any level of success, they need to concentrate a significant amount of combat power to seize territory, right? Because just for clarification for the listeners, generally when you're dealing with offensive operations, you want a 3-to-1 ratio in your favor to achieve, success. That's Western, but it looks like the Russians multiply that significantly to 5-to-1, 6-to-1, 7-to-1, even in some reporting we get. And so I'd like your intake. Do you think this is just Russia can only achieve success when they completely outnumber the Ukrainian defenses in key points?
Yeah, I agree. And just to say this, there are areas in Ukraine where Russia outnumbers more than 8-to-1, and they still can't take ground. So they definitely need they outnumber it. But I think another problem is that they don't really take the time to build up their forces. They get like a certain amount of like reinforcements per unit time. I don't know if it's like per day or per week or whatever, and then they just kind of throw them into combat. They don't really sit back and build up a large enough force. This is kind of what we're seeing around Avdiivka, where just every day they throw these assault units forward, and they might take some ground or they might get wiped out, but it's never enough men to actually break through and do anything successful. So they're just taking huge casualties. It's like they're very impatient and illogical and irrational with the ways they're using their resources. So I think it's both that they need that huge that to outnumber a lot, but they also need to just be more intelligent with the way they use their men in the first place. Because they might have like the raw numbers to outnumber, but like a lot of them might be in reserve and incapable, at least temporarily incapable of attacking. Whereas if they were to wait, 2 or 3 weeks or a month, maybe they would all be ready. They could all go for it at the same time. I don't know.
Just before going to hands, you noted that the Ukrainian practice with artillery around Avdiivka may be a little bit different. There have been reports the Russians may be shifting some of their power toward Avdiivka, or that the situation there might potentially be more dangerous now than even around Bakhmut. Are you seeing that's an area we should be paying more attention to?
Yeah, definitely. I think they're shifting more to Avdiivka, but I don't know where they're shifting them from. It seems, because I don't think they're pulling them from Bakhmut. I might be wrong, but I don't think they're pulling them from Bakhmut. So it makes me wonder where they're pulling from, because I don't actually know. Maybe they're pulling from like Kremenna, maybe. I'm not really sure, but they're definitely sending people to Avdiivka, but they're sending them in very small quantities, and that's kind of their problem. Where they don't have enough guys to do full-on attacks. So like if you send like 10,000 men one at a time, it doesn't make a difference. So
Okay, go ahead, Exit.
The last time you were here, you noted that there was a distinct lack of ammunition, and that we weren't seeing as much artillery fires as one would hope. Is that just logistics have changed because things dried up for a week, or do you have a theory on that in any way?
do you mean the Russian firing or the Ukrainian?
Ukrainian, sorry.
Okay, so I don't actually know what happened with the Ukrainian. There's a theory, and I can tell you the theory. The theory is that Ukraine rebuilt their logistics, and in that time when they were rebuilding it, everything kind of slowed down, so that they couldn't deliver as much as they wanted to for that period of time. And that period of time, I don't know how long it was. Maybe it was like 2 weeks or something. I don't know. And then now that logistics is restructured, and they can deliver more now, and because the units are getting more ammo now than they did like 2 weeks ago. So, and that's a theory that I've heard put forward by a number of people in the Ukrainian military. They don't know for sure. That it's just their guess, and I'm just kind of like just like echoing their guess. I don't actually know, but I do know that they have more ammo now than they did before by a lot. like we're talking like 15, 20 times more ammo. And I don't know how long this will stay. Like, I don't know if they have like, a week of ammo or a month, or I don't know. But for right now, they have a lot more ammo.
Gurney, you did have your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Well, I saw Conrad down there, and I had mentioned this in a different space earlier today, but I was going to ask All Source and maybe Conrad to come up here, Conrad Musica, to ask All Source and Andrew here this question, and that's just that some others that are respected in the analysis space just sort of challenging that default Western assumption that massing that massing of forces is both the force that can mass and concentrate and use surprise is the force that wins. And just say, so Dr. Jack Watling sort of discussed this week in a different forum with Modern War Institute. And so just in talking that, I wanted to flip that back to you guys in terms of the question here, though, is, you're asking, can Russia effectively use these masses? And Watling takes the opposite and say, it's to Ukraine's advantage that Ukraine can disperse in command and control to some extent, but that Ukraine is winning from the aspect that they're forcing the Russians to mass, and therefore the efficiency of dispatching and killing the Russians is therefore made easier for the Ukrainians, at least in terms of efficiency of inputs to outputs from that perspective. So I just wanted to say that when you made that question, All Source, to Andrew. And thanks, guys. Great discussion.
So it was, I think, to either Andrew or All Source, if either of you would like to chime in on that question.
Hey, sorry, Michael. I apologize, Gurney. I was actually on the call when I heard my name, and unfortunately, I do have to drop. I just got a family event that I got called into, so unfortunately, I have to drop. So I'll pass it on over to Andrew to answer that. Sorry, guys.
Well, I mostly agree. I don't really I don't know what to say. When I say massing infantry, what I was talking about before is just like maybe attacking with 30 guys isn't as good as attacking with like 100. That's more of what I was talking about. But I agree with the more general concept of massing huge amounts of people. It definitely allows Ukraine to play to its strengths of its superior firepower with like Gimlers and various other weapons. So I agree.
Andrew, thank you very much for the update. I do have one question that's not exactly Ukraine related, but I understand that you're doing more of your presentations on YouTube now, and so we'll try and get one of your tweets that links to your YouTube up so that people can follow that. I know for a time you had been doing your presentations on TikTok. I think I had heard you may have had problems with TikTok. Are you able to speak to that?
It wasn't TikTok, it's Twitch. But
oh,
yeah,
sorry, yes.
I got a 30-day suspension for showing a Russian spilling his borscht.
Okay, so I was wondering whether it might have been, sort of trolling or people trying to disrupt your work and knock you off of Twitch. But when you say it that way, do you think you kind of understand what it was for? And
yeah, it was. I played a video where I didn't know, like, I forgot, I forgot that like the last like 1 second of the video shows some spilled borscht, and they banned me. It's a 30-day suspension. It's probably like half over now, but whatever.
And here I had you getting banned over the hot tub video. Bond, I owe you money.
Okay. All right, I'll pay up. So on that basis, given your brief experience on YouTube, are you preferring YouTube? Do you think you will go back to Twitch? when your ban is up? Because I had thought that perhaps they were just unfriendly to war content, even just analysis, but it's sounding like that might not be the case.
I mean, YouTube is better in some ways, and Twitch is better in other ways. So it's just you know, it's just different. So YouTube has higher video quality, and it can have better latency depending on how you set it up, and it has some nice things like that. And then but Twitch is, I think, easier to watch and easier to talk to your audience. And generally we just had more viewers on Twitch, which was nice. but yeah, to me there's really no difference between the two. It's just how your audience finds it. So I don't it doesn't really bother me either way.
Did Twitch have a? I haven't really used Twitch much, but does it have like the same availability to do like shorts and stuff like that YouTube does? So like those shorter video or clips that you could possibly highlight when you want to try and make a point or highlight one?
It's called a clip. You can clip videos, but really, I would just stream it on Twitch, and then there's a button on Twitch that sends it to YouTube, so you could put it on both. So that's just kind of what I did. I just pressed the button that sends it to YouTube.
Yeah, okay, I get that.
Okay, well, I certainly hope that you pick up more subscribers on YouTube so that that you won't be concerned about audience size. I suspect you ultimately won't have trouble with that. We will get a link to your channel up in the nest in just a moment. And I encourage everybody to follow Andrew on YouTube, and if you look in his profile, you'll also, if you go back a little ways, find links to his Twitch channel. So if he does resume doing his presentations there, I would suggest you check that account out as well. So Andrew, thanks very much. If you'd like to stay for some of the conversation, it will be a little bit philosophical about OSINT, and I suspect you may have some more or some valuable insights. But if you have to take off, I understand. Exit, did you want to go ahead?
I can, or I can hold my question. Up to you.
Not knowing what it is, I'll roll the dice. Go ahead.
Andrew, after your last visit, I had one question that occurred to me that I wanted to ask you. Are there certain units or commanders that, as you're watching them now over this prolonged period of time, that you kind of can predict their next move and have an understanding of what they'll do next or how they will respond to something?
Yes, there are a few. To be honest, some of my favorite commanders aren't commanders anymore, which is kind of unfortunate. But yeah, there are a few. Well, there's one in particular that this commander, I don't want to name who it is, but this commander is very forthright in communicating with especially Western audiences. If they give press passes to anyone who asks for one. So if you are a journalist, you can go talk to them and have a little conversation. And there are journalists who do this, and there are articles that are coming out soon, because I think one very famous journalist just spent time there this week. So I think there's going to be a big article coming out. But yeah, I can predict what they will do, depending on what the situation is. If you look at the situation, you can kind of tell if they are going to attack or defend, or how they're defending. Just using logic and their statements, and just past conversations and stuff. But there's really only a few that I have that sort of relationship with, and a few of the ones who I had closer relationships with were relieved of duty for political reasons, which is unfortunate, but that's what happened.
All right. Well, thanks very much for that last question and answer. and hopefully, Andrew, you'll be open to coming back and updating us again in a week or two, particularly if we do see that this higher use of artillery is in preparation for an offensive. So we have a new speaker, Emergent Perspective. Go ahead.
Hey guys, I've been up here before. I just had a very quick update on the whole balloon shoot down incident following the Chinese spy balloon, and a couple of you already responded to this one. If you check my pinned tweet, there's an update. So NORAD publicized an incident yesterday, actually. So they intercepted, they detected an object in airspace over South Texas. I'll just read the headline here. NORAD press release conducts routine operations investigate unknown radar track over South Central Texas. Colorado Springs, Colorado. NORAD detected an unidentified radar track over South Central Texas on March 25th. Launched aircraft to visually investigate situation. NORAD aircraft identified a small airborne object as likely a hobbyist Pico balloon and assessed the object posed no immediate military threat or safety of flight hazard. NORAD will continue to track and monitor the object in coordination with FAA to ensure continued flight safety. So I think this is pretty much a parallel incident to the three we had before, the ones over the Great Lakes and over Alaska. And this confirms what I got from my professional contacts who still work at NORAD, is that basically those three balloon incidents were an administration overreaction to the political response to the first Chinese balloon incident. So this is really a clear illustration of what happens when those decisions are left in the hands of the actual pilots and the engagement coordinators who ordinarily make them. Is cooler heads prevail, the standard ROE prevails, and I think the earlier incidents were pretty parallel to this one. But anyway, I thought that was interesting and worth bringing to y'all's attention.
Thanks very much. I did see you note that spending $400,000 to shoot down a hobbyist balloon is very expensive. So that's a great point. That
Sure.
if it can be investigated cheaply, then that's the way to go.
Sure, and not to mention, it's politically embarrassing. And, during my time working at NORAD, I just think it's, in some ways, the administration stepping in and trying to force an engagement decision like that is a bit like if a hospital CEO went down to the operating room and slapped the surgeon's hand away from the patient and said, no, do it this way, right? There is a certain local expertise that wise leadership relies on, which I think really should have been the way they handled the earlier incidents. But I think it got so much political attention that they ended up overreacting and really creating more embarrassment.
Well, thanks for that update. I hadn't seen that until you tweeted it out this morning. So that's a good story to follow. Having now spoken with or spoken to Andrew and referring to his YouTube, if you look at the Nest, there are two links. First of all, it was a reminder, I didn't mention it at the top of the show, that friends of this space are streaming the audio from this space to YouTube, and they have convinced me to put a camera off to the side on myself so that there's something to look at, whether interesting or not. That's a bit of an experiment. I understand those friends of the channel are streaming Twitter, OSINT or Ukraine related talks more broadly. So you may want to check out some of the other spaces that are there. And I think there's a bit of a repository of some of our past content if you wanted to check it out. As well, the second item in the Nest, thanks very much to Jacoby for tweeting it out, is a link to Andrew's YouTube channel. So I would encourage you to check him out there. All right, moving on. So sort of to set the stage for a bit of a conceptual discussion about what are we doing as an OSINT community, how can we help out? I thought I would put up a few items from the last few days that I think maybe shape a little bit that question about, what is open source intelligence? Why are we engaging in it? So the first two I would draw your attention to, you have to scroll back a little ways in the nest because I put up 4 or 5 at a time. There was a tweet up in the nest, it's I think the 6th back perhaps, by the Institute for the Study of War. And they are passing along an article that is by the Modern War Institute at West Point. And it discusses the role of human vetting in open source intelligence, to the extent that, you know, many countries are now becoming more interested in this. Of course, they're being at West Point, they're writing from the US perspective, but noting that essentially human vetting is a critical part of the process. And so, you know, the US Military Academy putting out an article reveals sort of their thought process on OSINT. So I would encourage you to have a look at that if you're interested in their view of things. The next item in the nest that's similarly, or it's related, it's a tweet by Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat. And he's highlighting an article from a site that writes about intelligence more broadly called the Cipher Brief. And it's advocating that countries, particularly the United States, set up an open source intelligence agency that would not be classified, with the idea being to avoid what they refer to as the secrecy trap. And I think that's something that might be overlooked by people who aren't familiar with open source. They think, oh, it's open, so that means it's the things that are published on Twitter. But of course, the open refers to the open source, not the open output. And so if the United States or other countries are engaging in open source intelligence, they might not make their results public. And this is an argument being put forward that an agency should be stood up. I mean, a country could engage in classified OSINT, but this is arguing that at the same time there should be an open source element to the output as well. And I thought it was an interesting argument in any event. I'll go through hands. I didn't see the order, but I'll go to engineer and then Wolverine. Go ahead.
So yeah, and I think it would definitely be a beneficial thing. When you look at what happened at the beginning of the war, the way that the US Western intelligence agencies got the word out into the public sphere that the invasion was happening and it was coming soon, and these were likely to be the plans, which is why every major news outlet published literally the Russian war plans of, like, there was 3 different versions that were published, and they were published about a week before maybe days before the war happened. And they needed to launder their own information through New York Times, Washington Post, Daily Telegraph, in order to, they couldn't just come out and say it. They had to basically send it to journalists, and then the journalists said, oh, well, our contacts at undisclosed national intelligence agency have said this. Whereas have an intelligence agency that effectively knows where to look because they know where the bodies are buried, and then they can go away and find the same picture of the bodies on Google Earth or a commercially available satellite photo repository. They don't need to tell anyone how they know where to look, but the fact that they've gone, oh, well, we just happened to find it on like Airbus imaging, gives them, I think, would help improve the public's perception and trust in our intelligence agencies, which were massively, rightly damaged after Iraq, because that was the thing. When we were talking about this 12 months ago at the beginning of the war, everyone loved. There was a loud vocal minority that loved to say, "Oh, but do you remember Iraq? Do you remember when the U.S. intelligence agencies got this wrong? Do you remember when we led into a war that wasn't the information didn't stack up?" But if you have kind of, look, these are the satellite photos.
this is the evidence. This is the freely available public information evidence. Go look it up yourself. I think that helps massively.
That's a great point, particularly about the Iraq counterexample. Wolverine, go ahead.
So as far as forming a separate service, I don't really see that they ever do that, or a second agency or branch, whatever, because a lot of the military actually go through classes specifically for OSINT. That's actually a big thing that they take into account too, because, you know, it's like the old adage I used to say, you know, if you go into a bar, a bunch of military guys, you go in there, have a drink for about an hour, and you can probably find out 3 different units that might be deploying just by listening to other people, you know. But it's the same thing. They do that as well. But, you know, it's a joke for them. They call it, it's the Army's way of teaching them how to use Google search, which is their joke. But they actually use that a lot, and they take into account of it. But the only problem is sometimes with that kind of information at their level, or anybody's level, is they have to verify it. They just can't say, oh, hey, we saw a dead body here. This may be part of a grave. They have to go back that source up and say, okay, we have 1, now we have 2 or 3 different sources that are backing up the same, the same photograph or a statement or something, you know, that's posted out there. They just can't take it at face value and run with it. Now they, you know, if they say, hey, yeah, we see this, it's the only thing we'd find, they're probably going to like not go with it just because they can't back it up and they can't validate it. And that can sometimes take a long time to actually get that done. But I mean, like on the U.S. military side, there's so many different aspects of the military, the intel community, that we have access to, or that the military has access to, you know, and if it would blow people's mind if they realize, you know, that like how much of what these intel guys sometimes do in their task of what they do. Some of it's very mundane and very boring, but it, you know, at times it's all just part of the job of collecting up all the information and providing it as a, you know, a factually supported report to, you know, whether it be a general or someone else, that they can understand, they can make a conscious decision on what they need to do with this information. But that's why I don't see it being used, you know, as an agency, just because if the Army's doing it, the Marine Corps is doing it, the Navy is probably doing it, and the Air Force is doing it as well. But they also have assets like, you know, so you'd say, hey, we saw all these mounds at grid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You know, they can send a Gray Eagle or a Global Hawk or something like that and get pictures, you know, of that same exact area, and they can verify it, you know, a lot more rapidly than open source Intel can. They could use it as a stepping stone sometimes, but, you know, like I said, it's just because it's not verified at times, a lot of that stuff can get tossed out unless you get a lot of it. Now, I'll have to talk to someone because they might be able to tell me this, because someone I know actually told me, like, with the invasion, they knew months months ahead of when, before Russia invaded, that Russia was actually going to invade, you know. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? It's like, yeah, fuck yeah, we knew about that shit, you know, like this amount of time forward. And it's like, well, why didn't they do it? It's like, hey, we only process the information and we send it on, and that's it, you know. And it just goes to show how much that we don't know and we don't see, and what our government is actually willing to post and tell us with everything going on.
And, you know, Wolverine, your comments raise at least 2 interesting points, one of which is when there is an existing agency, it has an audience, right? So when there's intelligence collection for the Army, it's for Army purposes. And that begs the question, if there were an open source, perhaps not an agency like standalone, but dedicated to the purpose, who would they be aimed at? Because to the extent that they can aim it in a particular way, they might not have to be as purpose driven, you know, to like on the ground effects, if you know what I mean. The other thought that crossed my mind from your comments were when you talk about the difficulty in getting a second source of verification, is that if you're using an agency that's unclassified, there might be sort of a lower barrier for exposure in that they could be releasing information with the purpose of beating the bushes to try to draw out additional sources. But this is just me tossing ideas around. I will go back to you in just a moment, Wolverine, but I see that Random has been waving quite a bit, so I'll go to Random first and then Wolverine. Go ahead, Random.
Yeah, sorry. It's just this conversation made my brain click something back into place, which is there is an agency that does do open source intelligence within the U.S. government, and they have their West Branch where I currently live, and that is the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And they do a lot of OSINT work. They had an OSINT GitHub set up since 2014, and they've been releasing images and doing work with the open source intelligence community with the Russo-Ukrainian war. They've been releasing a lot of images and stuff through them. I also know they're hiring. So they've been looking for OSINT people to do more on the technical side and the geospatial intelligence side. So they are actively hiring OSINT people for the government. It's just not as broadcast because the agency does more satellite side and imaging side. But there are people in the U.S. government that do open source that is not really a separate in-house branch with all the intelligence services, but themselves. But that is the agency that does a lot of OSINT.
Do you have a link to anything? I might know a few people interested in that.
Oh yeah, I saw a link for a one on Indeed. I can link you one.
Okay.
So number one, great tip on the geospatial agency. In particular, I didn't know they had a GitHub, so I'll check that out. With regard to the idea of hiring, it has occurred to me to hold a space to talk about careers in OSINT. And I mean, I'm no expert on it. Certainly, I'm not working in OSINT. I'm not getting paid for any of this. But there are folks even floating around here on Twitter who that is their sole focus. There's an account called OSINT Jobs that just tweets out opportunities here on Twitter. So I'd encourage people to check that out if you're interested, and maybe we'll do a space on it. Wolverine, did you want to come back?
Yeah, so the only thing I was gonna say is that if Army gets it, and it's not limited just to the Army, it goes by where this information is coming from. So they get some weird thing, if you have a unit that's let's say it's in Montana, they get some weird open source stuff like that, and it pertains to let's say there's a Marine Navy unit operating in Somalia, and it pertains to that. Well, they're going to share that information to those different, units across the board. They're not just going to say, "Ooh, this is our own information." No, they will share the information that goes across. Now, when it comes to like the NSA, CIA sharing with the military and back and forth, there is such a hot mess between all those. They hold everything to the chest, and as people have said, the NSA and CIA are dicks about giving up their information unless it's like a massive amount of lives are on the line and everything like that. But all the information is shared if it pertains to an area that needs to know about the information so it can be passed on.
Yeah, the whole dynamic of what information to hold on to and what to make public is tricky, particularly when you're a country that has the means to act on it as opposed to just an individual on the internet. But it makes me think that if an open source based agency can derive the information, then anybody can derive the information, and which isn't to justify everything should be exposed so much as if we know it and others can know it, then perhaps it's best to get it out there to drive the development of information more fully, because our adversaries may potentially be doing the same thing already.
I just want to say real quick one more thing on that one. So
sure.
The only problem you get with that is, let's say that someone put someone said to someone, "Hey, someone's grandmother's driving down the highway the wrong way," right? And it gets put on the military side. Even if it gets put on the unclassified, the only way you can get it is with a FOIA, and then if some idiot actually sits there and goes even higher than that and puts it on the secret side, well, then once it becomes a secret side, it's got to go through like a whole process to get declassified, because who cares about someone's grandma going the wrong way in a highway, unless they're like carrying an IED, but that's a different thing. But that's one of the problems is as a lot of people misclassify information. And so, if someone sits, and there's also there's what we call spillage, where someone sits there and they send up, secret information, and it ends up on the unclassified net, and that causes a whole, a whole issue right there as well. So even though it's unclassified, it's still encrypted as well. And it's I think the only way you can get a lot of that information was with a FOIA request.
A lot of people are probably thinking about this conversation about, overclassification in agencies in the context of the United States, but we have listeners and speakers from Canada, the UK, Australia, and several European countries right now. And so, there's also the concept of, even if there is interagency rivalry or overclassification issues, if some of these other countries like Canada or the UK set up very good OSINT-based agencies, that's going to set the bar for what information is out there publicly. So it'll be interesting to see how that all works out. I believe it was Exit, and then I think ID10T. Go ahead, Exit.
So the article that the ISW linked to was from the Modern War Institute. They specifically talked about what you were just saying, Wolverine, that they essentially couldn't use. What would happen is they would find OSINT information literally walking out of work to go use their cell phones, their private cell phones, because they could get better information and quicker information using their private cell phones. They would then have to take it back into work, and it would suddenly become classified, and then all of those processes that needed to happen to unclassify information to be able to share it with other institutes that were really important and needed to know this information suddenly came into effect. And that's specifically the issue that they're talking about, is that you're taking open source information that's out there that literally anybody could use, and in order to work with it, it had to become classified, and then it hindered communication with not only the US government agencies, but then also external agencies, as Mr. Bond was just talking about, in other governments. And so invariably, they did come up with a solution to share it amongst some of the agencies, but there were still other agencies that would take open source information and put it in like the highest levels of classified communication between the two agencies, and then it would just be completely useless. And they still were never able to actually communicate that information back and forth to external governments that could have made use of that information as well. So it just became this like ridiculous sticking point of, we're taking open source information that we want to be able to verify. There's nobody who can actually verify this information without making it classified in order to work with it, which is silly. They also didn't have enough people to even do the work of verifying this, whereas like that's a whole manpower issue to begin with. And then to transfer that information between the different facilities that actually be able to use it. And part of what they were specifically trying to do with this information was to use it in forward-facing public communications. They would have to declassify it again, even though it was an open source piece of information, in order to use it in a public communication. And it just became so redundant that it wasn't useful for the purposes that they were trying to do. So the point of this entire article is essentially that, excuse me, sorry, there's just so many checks and balances around everything that it effectively made open source information that was out there, that was better information than what they were getting at the time, and quicker information than what they were getting at the time. It made all of that information useless to them because they just couldn't pass it back and forth. And so the argument is, at the end of it, how exactly to solve that. And one of the ideas was to create a new institute for that, but the other one was to basically outsource that and farm it to some of these other structures that already deal with open source information on a daily basis, like Bellingcat Institute for Study of War, and possibly other ones that might be out there?
It's interesting that the daily updates by the British intelligence headquarters have become quite popular, but they've also received some criticism that essentially they're just they're covering news from Twitter that's just OSINT news, and that it's not even cutting edge, but that by their willingness to adopt it, it gives it sort of an imprimatur or like a stamp of minimal government approval, of analytical approval. And it's not necessarily clear that they intend to grant it any specific authority. So it's seeing how it is evolving is pretty interesting. And likewise, probably most people aren't paying attention to it, but the Canadian Intelligence Agency is doing a similar thing to the British, but they're only doing it about once a week, and their level of specificity is even lower. So it's interesting to see how initial attempts to make open source statements have been extremely cautious and not particularly productive. We will come back around to Wolverine down the road. I do want to get some other voices in, though, who have been waiting. So we'll go to ID10T and then Engineer. Go ahead, ID10T.
Okay, thank you. Wolverine, I will confirm, I understand. Many of the three-letter acronyms are viewed as dicks, to much of their frustration. Random, you mentioned the National Geospatial Service, and yes, they do put out some good information. They get their satellite data from the National Reconnaissance Office. NRO, National Reconnaissance Office, has many customers, to include the other three-letter acronyms. The NGA is the most dependent on NRO. That said, Exit, you said much of what I wanted to say. If I am an intelligence organization and I am utilizing open source intelligence, that's a broad spectrum of information. So if I am looking for a flag, a red flag somewhere, and I use my system and information collection on open source to identify a receipt from a shipping container that used a phone number, and I correlate that phone number to a police report from a stolen car, I've now correlated two places in time and two things to one phone number, and that might be two different individuals. And if I had correlated that from open source, that individual's identification in that correlation, how do I keep that from going to the public? Well, then it's classified. And I keep information from being disseminated out to adversaries or targets or to the public domain by classification. So I'm going to ride the coattails of what Wolverine said. That no, I don't think an intelligence organization needs an OSINT organization. Historically, we have used OSINT. They have used OSINT to a great extent to derive or identify information that could assist or confirm other areas or tell us where to look, where to listen. So just by the act of drawing from open source into an intelligence organization, thereby information gathered should be classified. So in regards to information sharing, there are large pipes going up. So the higher in the intelligence arena, information flows up, and very, very skinny, tiny pipes going back down. And respectfully, that's for various security measures. And outside of Five Eyes, and to explain, we have a partnership with a number of nations. Everybody here should know, but U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain. There is a great deal of fluidity of information. if you mark that information as Five Eyes, or you're in an environment and an office that is identified as Five Eyes, you get outside of that Five Eyes and it becomes, I can speak to the American aspect, that takes a great deal to go through your your SSO, your security office, and say, okay, yeah, we can share that information either to under echelons, to military units. If it's actionable intelligence that we need a team to do a thing, then that information will be curtailed for that team, and those individuals will be read on or given access to that information in order to act. But dissemination is by requirements of mission.
And I'm always impressed by the array of experience we can gather in the space, because I understand from past comments that ID10T may be speaking from some experience having been in the intelligence community. So I'm sure it's frustrating both on the inside and from the outside perspective. Engineer, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, and this is something I think that's been touched on by the three previous speakers, is that it boils down to what you'd want this organization to do, whether it be hypothetical structure to do, and it does have each of those problems identified of classification of information in computer networks that it's held on, but also what the purpose of it would be for. In my mind, just looking at from the success that was had last February, and I do think it was a success, and the thing that marks the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 over and above the 2014 one was the rapid dissemination of information to the public to make them aware of what was coming and effectively prepare the information space for the fight that was about to occur. Whereas you go back to Crimea, you can probably put some money on the fact that Western intelligence agencies had an idea of what was about to happen, but they were caught flat-footed. They didn't spread that information to the public. They didn't, and there's other reasons why a reaction wasn't possible at that time, or not kind of an overt reaction that we've seen since in kind of 2022. But you could argue that an organization you'd set up explicitly for this purpose wouldn't be to communicate information into the rest of government or the rest of the intelligence agencies or the rest of the armed forces. It would be primarily there for dissemination of information and influencing the information space in kind of the public, to counter disinformation campaigns, to improve the quality of information that is in the hands of the general public, and that to do that in such a way that has backing, because this is the problem with you can say Twitter today, or the news, many of the news networks today, is that people don't trust something just because it's on CNN anymore. And if I'm honest, wearing my tinfoil hat, neither should they. There's a lot of news networks that have been caught one too many times now, just saying something because someone else said it, and not doing the hard yards to find the kind of primary sources, or ignoring primary sources where it's inconvenient. And no doubt a government agency would do some of the same things, but if it was a primarily open source information agency as opposed to an intelligence agency, and it could have those links in with the three-letter agencies that would effectively inform it of, hey, you might need to look in this field, in this grid coordinates. We're not going to tell you why you should be looking there, but look in that field at that date. Look at that tweet from that person, aggregate these things, and they'd have that guiding hand that would then influence this intelligent information organization to disseminate useful, actionable, understandable information into the public space that would be able to have a kind of shaping operation on how certain actions are perceived.
It's not your fault for saying it the way you did, engineer. But you did make me think that we should do an OSINT themed Cheers parody. People getting by in the world today. All right, but in any case, you made some great points. It just as a reminder, guys, with all the sites and the things you see in the world today, don't forget to like and retweet the space. It sure does help a lot. You see, it's so easy to get into the Cheers song. But please do like and retweet the space if you enjoy listening to it. Share it with your friends. Share it on YouTube. It obviously does a great deal to help branch out, and we get more people in the community and into the bar. And sometimes you want to go to where Mr. Bond is. I don't know.
I love Random as our color man, or maybe our hype man.
You do remind me of Sam from Cheers a little bit in that photo. I'm just gonna say.
All right, I'll take it. So to engineer's point, one thing that will be interesting will be to see how different countries approach the degree of classification and degree of dissemination. And I think it's an area ripe for a bit of experimentation. It will be curious how, I mean, we may never be privy to it or get to see it, but it will be interesting to see how much Five Eyes members may try to influence one another to establish sort of minimum standards on their OSINT approaches that may limit their ability to experiment, fully. But that back and forth pressure is interesting to me. I also happen now to be imagining OSINT engineer wearing a tinfoil Lego construction hat. Exit, would you like to go ahead?
Just to echo those last two, information is more and more and more available. We all know this. We're all using it for the most part in here. We use it on a regular basis. Governments are going to have to learn to deal with that, and how they choose to do that is really the bigger question here. It's not so much whether or not you need a new institute to be able to deal with OSINT information. It's you're going to have to deal with OSINT information. How are you going to do that? And how open are you going to be about communicating the things that you want people to hear? And how are you going to prove that those things are truthful? You can choose to do it quietly, like you traditionally have, or you can choose to do it more openly in certain cases, and that might lead people to believe more of what you say in general. And that's probably the bigger discussion that government bodies need to be having.
And so, transitioning the conversation a little bit from what happens at the government level down to what are we doing here on Twitter, I think this dovetails with a few things we talked about. Hopefully it's not too personal a story, but two examples just from interactions I had in the last day or two. Up in the nest, and these happen to be from the same account, Secret Squirrel. Nothing against Secret Squirrel. I follow him, and he puts out some interesting analysis. These just happen to be places where he and I disagreed on points. And so the first goes to his description of what Oryx and his team is doing. And you'll see his tweet says that it looks like Oryx is way, way behind in keeping up with his list. But it's clear that his numbers are way off on Russian losses. And he notes that he says one of the guys behind the counting may have left Oryx. And then down in his thread, he says that, hey, look, there are these yards that have assembled destroyed vehicles in them, and these aren't counted. And he's using that as an example to say, well, Oryx is behind. And so the reason I'm noting this is because having followed Oryx's work closely, he's wrong on several points, including saying one of the main guys may have left. Right, Jacob was pretty clear in his post saying he can't sit at the desk for hours and that he's going to keep working, but he can't be the primary consolidation point. And, so I don't understand why he would say that somebody has left, giving the implication that there may be discord, which is not the case. And then when he's highlighting these yards of destroyed equipment, Oryx so I haven't actually seen a single sheet that describes their standards in one place. I happen to have notifications on for Oryx and have for a year. And so I just have seen all of his commentary on how he has established his standards. And they have explicitly said several times that they don't count destroyed vehicles in yards like that because it's impossible to know whether they have been double counted, in that they were counted in their original destroyed location. And then if they've been hauled to a yard, that would be an overcount. And they're trying to establish a minimum. And several people in the replies to this noted that. So I'm glad to see that many are following and understand the purpose of the project. But, given his premise is that Oryx is way behind, he's trying to establish a minimum number, and that consistently, and I'm glad to see that Nalcio is coming up to speak because he's on this team. Consistently, Oryx's numbers have probably been in the 75 to 85% of real losses figure, and at least that's how it corresponded with Pentagon estimates. And I know that when we asked this question of Nalcio a week ago or a week and a half ago, he similarly said about 80%. So I'm just highlighting that even somebody who is heavily engaged in analysis on Twitter hasn't invested the time to understand the parameters of another major OSINT project on Twitter, which is a shame. And I'm using it as an example to say, guys, pay attention to the details, because otherwise, you'll get an incorrect understanding of what a valuable resource like this is. But Nalcy has joined us. Did you want to comment on any of this?
Well, just to clarify with the collection points of destroyed equipment, is we don't touch them if the views are too poor. But if we can get multiple angles on a certain piece of equipment, then we can usually rule out whether or not it's counted. But generally speaking, especially the collection points in Russian held territory, it's a lot harder to double check to see if they match with anything on the list. So it's a little more complicated than the way you put it, but yeah, generally you're right that it isn't that we're majorly undercounting, just because, especially like the drone footage of all the equipment in Russia isn't on the list, doesn't mean that we're like way behind or something.
And was I right in saying you believe that the Oryx count is in the 80% range of actual?
For armor, yeah.
Okay.
Like I said before, it depends on the region, but 75 to 85% is about right.
Well, thanks very much for clarifying that standard. That's a good, wrinkle in the way you guys count it. Obviously, at a moment where you're going through transition and responsibility on the team, adding an item, it might not be a high priority, but have you guys ever considered publishing a single document that explains your standards for inclusion? Because I have only been following Oryx's tweets directly to determine what those standards are.
Yeah, that's something we could do. I think something like that would be more likely to pop up on the war spotting side, to be honest, because he's the dev of that site, has written things explaining unit markings, that sort of thing. So he might actually do that for losses as well. But yeah, it's a good thing to keep in mind. But then again, like, people have to actually read that too.
You make a good point that if they haven't taken the time to follow, maybe even if you make it easier for them, they still may not pay attention. So I won't dig for any more information, but I will just say publicly what I had said to you privately, which is that, you know, if Oryx's team or you need any help in, you know, whether it might be trying to find somebody who has some administrative expertise or a way to take some labor off your plate so that you can focus on the list a little bit more readily. I don't have it right at hand, but we do have an audience of people who are interested in keeping these things running. So, you know, if you ever think we might be of help, then please come back and let us know, and we'll try and find people to contribute, because if people might be keen to help, but they don't have the expertise to do the actual losses evaluation, but they might be willing to do, you know, the consolidation of the reports from the experts.
So just to clarify what the issue is it's not a problem relating to the collection and evaluation of sources. It's a technical issue of actually getting someone to work with the platform Works is using to show the list. So a solution will be found. So no one needs to worry that the lists will suddenly just stop being updated. At least that's something I'll make sure to happen. But yeah, the list isn't like, oh, we need to get people to help us look at all this footage and stuff. It's not that. It's the actual getting someone to sit down who knows all this to actually do entry for the list. And so we're going to look at certain technical solutions and everything. And if we want help with that, then we'll reach out to people on Twitter and so on.
Perfect. I'm glad to hear that in any event, the list will be maintained. And so I had brought that example up just to note that some of these projects, particularly where they involve counting or they have, you know, qualification standards, you need to understand what the standards are to know what the information you're reading actually is. And it's not fair to criticize a project if you haven't invested the time to understand all the caveats that they've already presented to you. And then my second example of an encounter on Twitter in regard to OSINT work, but at the very basic level. So it's the second item in the nest. This is kind of the middle of a conversation that developed because David had posted a thread on the role of China in potentially supporting Russia. And he made, you know, 8 or 9 points about what China is or is not doing. And then, but they were very summary points. And somebody in the replies had said, could you post some of the sources to support these? And a third party came in and said, you know, boy, it's kind of rude to request sources from somebody. And that offends my principles. So I wasn't arguing, but by way of explaining, I chimed in and said that you don't ask for sources only because you suspect something is wrong, which could be insulting, maybe, but you can ask for sources because often the original source contains way more detail than has been summarized briefly. So there were a variety of reasons. And then interestingly, David chimed in himself, essentially saying, hey, look, I am so high speed that I'm covering so many issues, I just can't slow down to include sources for you. You know, I said, well, okay, that's fine. But if you have the sources at your fingertips, it saves people time by putting them in up front because you have them, as opposed to everybody having to look for them. It can be quite a challenge if those sources are in a foreign language, or, you know, every so often I see somebody just making something up, or they have badly misinterpreted it. And he took a little bit of offense at me saying someone may have made it up, as if I was trying to indirectly suggest he was. So it was just a frustrating conversation to me. Ultimately, it resolved in a way that we can live with one, you know. I think we can both live with it, in that he said, look, I'm not going to include sources because it takes me too long, which is not very satisfying. But then he does say that if you would like a particular source, DM me and I'll see what I can do, which is, it's better than nothing. But I wanted to raise it as a point. Do any of you ever go into replies to request sources? Do you find that is it impolite? Because I didn't think it was a challenge. I just thought it was reasonable. And if somebody says, if somebody fails to respond, that's fine. Some accounts will source sometimes and not other times. And you just weight the quality of any particular response as is appropriate. But Exit, go ahead.
There are absolutely specific source or reporters who I always ask for sources, and I've just become obstinate about it because they never supply their sources, and I think that's just ignorant of them. And they also never reply when you ask for them. But it can take you hours to go and find their source, depending on who they are and what they are spouting about that time. And I think just based on the people who comment on me asking for sources or like the comment or all of those things, that it sets the example that people out there really should be providing sources, and that they encouraging your audience to be educated is a good thing, unless you really don't want to interact with your audience and you really just want them to believe whatever you spout no matter what. And I guess if that's your choice, then fine, but I'm not going to interact with you, and I'm never going to use your tweets as something that I trust and believe that I should retweet and send out there. So I encourage it. I guess I don't care if it's rude or not. And I think we should all do it.
I will echo that if somebody doesn't provide sources, I never use them. Like, even if they break the news, I will search until somebody puts up a version that includes the source, or I'll go and do it myself. That's a lot of what my tweets are. And the idea of I'm too busy or I'm covering too many subjects to include sources, I find frustrating. As somebody who invests a lot of time in putting my sourcing up, and I know that occasionally I'll have an interpretation and I'll be structuring a tweet, and then I'll look at the source and realize I had briefly misinterpreted it, and I catch myself. So it's, to a degree, it's a personal double check as well. Engineer, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll basically echo everything that Peter said. I think it's common purposes for a reader. If anything, it's more rude not to include the source. I know it can often be difficult, particularly when people are using newswire networks. But I'm a little tired of effectively everyone posting the same thing verbatim in caps and not sourcing where they got it from. It's fine if you're just saying, oh, hey, that, like, OSINT Technicals posted something. I will try and quote tweet wherever if I'm referencing another tweet, I will try and quote tweet that tweet, if not in the tweet, but in the replies underneath, I will try and reference where I found it from. And I think that's good due diligence so that people don't end up going round in circles. Because I think we do that, and that has happened in the last 12 months, and it's happened before. Yeah, so I don't really understand that. If I'm going to be very scathing, it will be if you're too busy because you're covering too much stuff, just generally, then maybe cover less things and do specific subjects better. This is why kind of specific journalists will dig into specific areas of work, and they'll be specialists in kind of one aspect of one thing. And I appreciate that Twitch is a little different, and that people have different ways that they work and ways that they like to work. And that may annoy people in the way I say that, but that's my hot take for this evening. And with that, I'm going to go to bed because it's now 10:35 in the UK. So have a nice evening, everyone. I'll probably drop to listener for a bit and then fall asleep.
Thank you very much for joining us. We always appreciate when you can. This is partly why
Mr.
we
Bond.
do Sun.
The verb back, Mr. Bond.
Maybe we'll go to Riverside Kitty, please, for a second.
First, I want to apologize to engineer. I hit the wrong emoji, and I meant to hit the laughing emoji when he suggested that maybe if you're too busy to put a source, you might try cutting down on your work. So that was supposed to be a laugh emoji, and I 100% agree with it and most of the comments here. I don't see in any way why it should be rude to ask for a source. Someone's giving information. You want information, you know, to people to pay attention, and you're asking for a source, as long as you're not, you know, like attacking them, where's your source or something like that. Although I would say most of the time, if I'm interested in retweeting, I will ask for a source if they don't have one. And unless it's just absolute bullshit, then I will go ahead and say, yeah, what's your source? You know, that kind of thing. But I'm surprised to hear, Exit, that you find that the reporters are too lazy or something, did you say, to put sources in? That's a little surprising.
I find when it comes to journalists that it partly depends on their publication, and some practices are more reasonable in that, for example, I'll see some of the Reuters journalists posting things that are literally breaking. They're absolutely the first person to write about it, and their article comes out, you know, in 15 or 20 minutes, but it's in the production process. But there are others who just make a habit of it, which I find frustrating.
The Ricky Bobby method does not work with the industry. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, the if you're not first, you're last is not always true. Okay, we've got lots of hands up, so we'll try and run through them. And you know, if you can be, we'd love to hear what you say. If you can be brief, so much better. I think we'll start. I didn't see the order. We'll start with Heliana, and then we'll go to Aaron. Go ahead, Heliana.
Hey, this is a great subject. Yeah, I asked for sources a lot when I was still on Facebook, which I haven't been for a while. I used to ask for sources, and I would, you know, get booted from people because it's really important. Like, if you're saying something, you need to have sources, and especially in the last 2-3 years with all the misinformation that's been propagating throughout the world. But my question is, what about, you know, like aggregated sources? So there are books where they have really well-sourced information, in my opinion, and is that a good enough source, you know, to cite a book, for example? Is that good enough for you guys?
I mean, personally, I will, in connection with the war in Ukraine, there haven't been too many books I've been sorting, just because, you know, other than things like the military balance that are like catalogs, I imagine that citation of books would matter more in a historical context, or in a, you know, for example, those discussing things connected with the pandemic might have been talking about studies, you know. I would say that I certainly will cite books, but that I'll do a quick bit of research into the author or the publishing house, and, you know, so that it gets a little bit more granular at that point. I also, and I think this is fair to say, I put a little bit of responsibility on the readers of my own content, which is I have a bar, but my bar is not 100% guarantee of truth. It's, I have done a reasonable check that I would expect of others to do, and but that, you know, it's buyer beware a little bit as well, in that sometimes, particularly with breaking news, it's not 100% accurate. And so, you know, others may have opinions on books, but I'm certainly open to using them.
I'm going to
Uh,
go down the rabbit hole about
Sure.
footnotes and books and history books if we don't keep going with hands.
For those who don't know, Random is a big history nerd, and he has done several spaces on epic tomes on the Russian Civil War and World War One.
And in order to do history, you have to know the Chicago style manual and font, which implies sourcing. And if in academia, if you fail to not source properly in the Chicago style, they deal with you the Chicago way.
Right. I'm not sure how many will get that reference, but I'll give co-host prerogative to Exit, and then we'll go to Aaron. Go ahead, Exit.
I just was going to side note your comment with I had an interaction today with somebody, a reporter, who specifically said they were correcting themselves and saying, "Hey, I was wrong," and another account basically said, "Hey, this is a really important thing to do. It's good that this reporter did this." And I had commented on the post agreeing with that, and somebody else challenged me and said that these posts are not useful. And I just would say that this goes back to providing your sources, admitting when you're wrong, makes you a better reporter and makes you any of us an account and a source that people will trust. And we won't always get things right. I certainly don't. And I correct myself when I do, because it's important to do that. And it makes people understand that when you do get something wrong, you will come out and say, "Hey, I was wrong. I learned something, moving on."
So to the audience, I know that this might be just a bit of preaching to the choir, but for people who have had to deal with this for months and months, hopefully you'll indulge us with another minute or two of conversation about it. Aaron, and then Wolverine. Go ahead, Aaron.
Hi guys. So Random is a military historian. I totally get what you were saying. 100%. On the other thing, I want to, for sources, just like for an example the other day, the sourcing stuff, like there was some data I was seeing on the nukes going into Belarus. Well, I waited. I was like, no, wait a minute, this might not be, until I get, sources that I trust that say and they're verify what it is, as far as data goes. It's really, it really does help. So I waited, and then I found out, so okay, we got some more concrete information, and then I posted about it. So I mean, the sources I trust, I learned almost it's very easy to get data that is wrong and then keep posting it out there, and then somebody else sees it and it just amplifies. But for sourcing, I find like the sources, like the best sources that I see on Telegram or Signal, I put them in a category, and I have the best sources like on Twitter and other sites like Telegram and all that in a I have it in a categorical area. So my trusted areas and data that I get, I know is more likely to be factual than not, because I know that there are a lot of other sources out there that come out with information that looks like, wow. But then I think to myself, I don't know this source. I don't know this person. And I'm like, yeah. And then I wait and I look at my other sources and they say the same thing. Then it looks like it's absolutely more probable. Or you go to like some of the mainstay data from Ministry of Defenses really does help. Like for stuff like I want to get on the Bauma report, I'll put it on like an ISW, or I'll get it onto some like from Oryx, definitely, and some of the main categories that I know to be truthful. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense for the war in Ukraine, or it'd be different sources for different areas. Like definitely like we've got for the Iran spaces, like we got Crazy 8, we've got Dakota. Those people as well put out trusting stuff, and so it's about knowing and trusting your sources, and that's such an important aspect to it. And that's one thing about OSINT that you learn, to ride the waves of information. Thanks, guys.
Wolverine, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, why not? So, for what I do, most people know that I basically deal with anything with weapons, weapon systems, anything that launches a projectile, except for like some of the ballistic systems and stuff like that. A lot of the stuff I use, the main one, which I have somewhere in here. Oh, it's right here. The main thing I actually use is Jane's. Jane's, you can't go wrong with Jane's because of the amount of work that they actually put into it. And the book is expensive as all hell. Now, mine is an older one, but it still has everything that's actually being used in Ukraine at this time. So I can go back and look onto it, and then I can actually use different things. So you can use Jane's, or for like armor, you can use FAS, you can use global security, and then as just a quick glance, and then you can reinforce off that. You can also use Wikipedia. You know, Wikipedia give it a lot of stuff, but you can sit there, and if you take a lot of the Wikipedia stuff like that, just cross it over, and you'll actually find out like, yeah, this is true or not. Other things that are like the newer systems, if you want to, from the Russian side, it's harder. But from the European side, it's actually easier because, you know, example, like let's say somebody wants to find out about the Rheinmetall's new Panther tank that, you know, with a 140 millimeter gun. Well, there's hardly no information out there, you know, except for Rheinmetall's site. So you can sit there and go and look up on Rheinmetall's site. You can get what information you get off of there because, you know, obviously they're not going to post everything. But sometimes you can actually just go look at who actually makes that individual piece of equipment and glean the information off of there and make it try and make the best picture that you can of what's going into that system, and then go from there with it. You know, the newest systems that are coming out, you know, they especially like the Rheinmetall Panther tank, or you know, a harder one. But example, let's say you take like a T-90, right? T-90's been around since the 90s, and yeah, they've gone through their upgrades, but the basic chassis, basic platform is still a T-90. And even though you may have like a Jane's, you know, from the first year it came out up until the newest one, the thing though is that it'll still have a lot of the basic information that you can still cross-reference across with other sources to verify it and then say it. So, you know, the other thing that I actually have is like when people are like talking about like, you know, like, and everybody laughs about this because this is a joke they say, but like T-72s, you know, people are like, well, how do you know so much about a T-72? I was like, well, I operated them for a while. I actually did a 180 and one on a concrete road, which was not cool. Personal experience actually plays into a lot of stuff I've done with a lot of the armor, you know, and a lot of it's the older stuff, but in ways, a lot of that older stuff is still even being used today, you know. The T-72s, the 2S1 self-propels, BRDMs, the different variants, MTLBs heavy. Ukraine's got so many MTLBs, it's stupid, ridiculous. But that's some of the best places you can do. Like I said, if you want to look at Wikipedia, cool, but you know, you might want to check out someone else too, if you want to. And as someone had once said, I think it was Jakubi, hey, where did you get this information from? Oh, from a video game. And, you know, it was like, no, that is not a reliable source of information. A video game is not. Aaron, I know you're going to say some, but no, it's not. But anyways, that's some of the stuff that, you know, I go off of the hard data because when it comes to combat systems, weapon systems and stuff like that, you have to go off it for the characteristic performance. Now, if you go talk about like, well, deployment of them, you know, it's one thing to someone to sit there and read the Army FM for whatever type of operations you're doing, but it's another thing when you actually have an individual who has actually done that job for a living and say, okay, yeah, but this is what we actually do, you know, because there's always variation of it, and the Army FMs are a basic guideline for all intent and purposes, and because sometimes they don't take in everything that you may come up across unexpectedly. You know, so that's kind of the two things: books and backing it up with other stuff, and then personal experience.
Thanks very much, Wolverine. Okay, guys, we will go through the last hands on this point. I do hope to move on to other topics. So if you can keep your remarks brief, it would be appreciated. Heliana, go ahead.
Yeah, so Michael, you made the point of, for historical kinds of books, that those could be good sources. And that and the whole ripping off of what Wolverine just said, Jane's is a great source, as well as the personal experience of somebody. So that's my main secondary source kind of, where I go to. And then I'm a scientist by training, and I go for, the original scientific, papers for primary sources, but that's a lot of the times that's really hard for people to dive into. So I will do a secondary source that interprets the scientific source. So obviously this is not OSINT. This is just generally speaking. And you guys are the expert on OSINT. I'm not. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Yes, I had a thought about book sources, but it's escaped me. So we'll just go to Aaron. Go ahead, Aaron.
So yeah, problems with games is that the games give a kind of a personality to things that are not necessarily accurate, and the problem is they have to modify data a lot of times for it to make better for gameplay, and that's the thing, is it's not accurate. That's the problem with the games, is they lead on that it's accurate, but it's not a lot of times, and that's the problem. Yeah, I mean, global security I love. FAS, Jane's, I've got a lot of Jane's books.
I would just like to state for the record that all War Thunder discussions will be saved for the Balma report and in any intelligence leaks thereof.
Speaking of which, for those who hadn't heard, Aaron does host his own spaces. He has one tonight at 10 p.m. So I would encourage you to drop by for further discussion there. We will find a link to the invite to his space. I drop by almost every time he holds one. Okay, so we spent, that actually engaged more conversation than I expected it to. I was setting that up as a conversation sort of about what are we doing on here on Twitter about OSINT. And I earlier described the idea of usually when these projects have started up, it's somebody who has a great idea for a type of data that needs to be collected and published, like Oryx or like Dimitri of War Translated, and who has enough organizational wherewithal and established enough of a reputation to gather a small team around them. But that it seems like transition from that to a more established, or small-scale institutionalized organization is a challenge. Particularly, different groups are taking different paths. War Translated has set up a Patreon, which I totally understand, and I think the majority of donations there are likely going to not necessarily labor time, because I don't think they're getting that kind of money, but even just software upgrades for the tools they're using to do their work. On the opposite side, Oryx, has specifically said, please donate to charity, don't donate to us. And so they're trying to, it's about organization. And so my thoughts on this are not fully formed, as you might be coming to tell. But I would love to have a bit of a conversation about, can we establish a labor pool or a talent pool of people who are willing to help out with projects like that, maybe not joining the project, but willing to offer, whether it be, hey, we can help you with consultation, we have knowledge of, say, productivity software. If if an organization wants to change their database software and they say it has to be free or it has to have a minimal budget, can we point people in the right way? Are there people willing to do basic promotional work, or I'm just trying to think of ways to support these projects that don't involve specialized expertise in the participants. And, you know, frankly, there are lots of spaces on Twitter. There are tons of podcasts about the war in Ukraine. And some of those are about educating people about what's going on. And I think that those spaces serve important purposes. But I would like to try to make this, you know, I'm not interested in, you know, several have taken the angle of trying to drive charity fundraising, which is an admirable goal. I would prefer not to duplicate those sorts of efforts, but rather to, you know, develop people who can help and work together. And so I guess I'm turning this from a conversation into a pitch. But if anybody has thoughts on how that could be developed, or, you know, is it even a worthwhile effort? You know, for example, I'm curious why people come to a space like the one that I'm holding. Is it mainly because you want to be informed? Are you treating it like the evening news? Or do you come here because you're already actively doing the work and you want to hear about the work that, you know, others are doing firsthand? Do you want to contribute to the work yourself? And, you know, I'm sure that it's a fraction of the total people who come to these spaces who have the availability and inclination to contribute. But I hope that, you know, it's not zero, and that some people start to come forward to say, hey, I would be willing to help. I know it's hard to ask that question in the abstract without knowing what that help might entail. But I'm really at the brainstorming stage now, which is why I'm externalizing my thought process, whether it makes sense to establish, you know, a job bank. Like we go to some of these projects and say, what is the type of help that you could use? And then we establish, you know, hey, we need somebody to do this type of work. It would be 4 hours a week. Can anybody fill to help out with that project? And you wouldn't necessarily be a member of the project. You would just help out on like a, you know, a basis to expand capacity for a time. I have no idea if anybody has any thoughts in response to that, whether it be about specifically helping out or whether you even just want to weigh in and say, why do you come? Do you come to listen to the news? Do you come to learn? Or are you interested in more?
And while we do that, just as a quick reminder, don't forget to like and retweet the space. I am habitually using the top of the hour to remind everybody that it helps out tremendously. And if you do so, you like this content, you like more, go ahead and like the space and then share it even more. Thank you, guys. That is all.
Okay, thanks, Random. It's good to know that I thought you were true to your name and just being random, but you're right, it is the top of the hour. ID10T, go ahead.
Appreciate everything you're saying. I think there's going to be some technical limitations within Twitter, but if there was a collaboration on another platform, say Discord, where the delineation between the consumers and some of the doers, not that there's anything wrong with the consumer, but if there's those that want to self-identify as a doer and want to do something, there could still be a localized place on a Discord channel where the various projects can be listed and screen sharing, where groups can collaborate.
So that's a good point. We do have some things in the works and may have a Discord available in the next little while. So that's a good suggestion for a little bit more functionality in that way. Jacoby, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. I actually had a question for ID10T, harkening back to something he said a little bit earlier, but I don't want to go back to it if you wanted to move on. So I'm happy to.
I have presented my idea, put it out to the world. People might be interested in it privately. If that's the case, feel free to DM me. The question remains open. We'll let Jacoby go ahead in a moment, but if anybody who's listening, wants to come up and say, nope, I am only interested in listening because I don't have the technical expertise or that kind of thing. Maybe this is a question that would best be asked with a poll of some kind. So maybe I'll do that for the next space, as opposed to putting people on the spot to come up and speak to it. In any event, Jacoby, go ahead with your question.
Thanks. It does sort of have something to do with what you're asking. I heard earlier ID10T say to speak to open source and how agency people may avail themselves of it, understandably so. And it makes me think back to something I read somewhere once upon a time, agency association with, I don't know if people are familiar with it. It's U.S. Peace Corps, people on the ground who, in one capacity or another, live in, it's far afield from what we're talking about in a certain way, but they live in cultures around the world to help with integration of U.S. humanitarian aid, for lack of a better way to describe it, on the ground. And there is a sort of, but they in a certain way, they live in a way that avails themselves of open information, sort of human, I guess human is actually exactly what they avail themselves of. And there was a point at which that agencies said, you know, we can't avail ourselves of the information that those type of people provide or come upon because that would be inappropriate. In a certain, you know, in sort of a parallel way, I look at open source information a little bit similarly, in that, you know, it's this information that oftentimes hobbyists and enthusiasts elicit, generate, aggregate, promote, amplify, and I wonder how, you know, how someone like yourself would, if challenged, think it ethically appropriate for agencies to mine that sort of information. Yeah, that's pretty much my question.
I am aware of other organizations in other nations that use various practices, anything that is available to them in order to place people in situations where intelligence can be gathered. I would say it's a good question. Absolutely, good question.
That's a pretty interesting answer, such as it is. I appreciate that.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that back and forth, guys. And just one more time, if anybody would like to sort of get more involved and transition from, you know, a listener to open to being a more active participant or doer in supporting some of these projects, feel free to DM me. I take ID10T's suggestion about a Discord to heart, and maybe you'll hear about that in a future space. Okay, so I was thinking, as per usual, we would run the conversation for about another hour. We're really just into news updates now. Some of these that I'm going to start with are items that are, you know, perhaps a week old because they were matters that we didn't cover on Thursday night. So they're not, you know, totally new. But
before we do that, Michael, could we like briefly mention the current breaking news, which is, as we've been doing this space, the Israeli government is probably collapsing? Real quick.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah.
I saw that the defense minister was fired, but what's happened beyond that?
So the defense minister was fired since we started this space, but since then, the head of the UN Council resigned in protest. The people have taken to the streets. Several cities, including the one city in Rahana, apparently the police have joined with the protesters. They are calling for the justice minister to be ousted. There's high civil unrest. Hundreds of thousands of people are marching down the streets of Tel Aviv. And they're saying that Netanyahu's become quite paranoid. So apparently there are nationwide protests now breaking out across the country in Israel. Major universities have called for strikes. Doctors have apparently decided to all call in sick tomorrow, according to the Jerusalem Post. And there's been a number of different issues going on. I will see if I can put some in the nest, but there's also major organizations within the governing coalition that are fracturing. Opposition figures have made statements tonight, as have former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, I believe. But in essence, the protests that have been taking place in Israel over the judicial bill being pushed by Netanyahu to change the way the government structure works in the judicial system has culminated into what looks like a collapse of Israel's governing coalition and nationwide protests.
Well, thanks for that. If there are any major developments, if people who are here with us listening see any major developments, feel free to request the mic and come up and you can update us. I don't have very much expertise in Israeli politics, so I don't know that I'll sort of switch the conversation over to that. But if anybody, not to open up a political conversation on it, but if anybody does see any specific developments, I'm open to staying up to date over the next hour. Jumping back into some of the more Ukraine related items to track, many of these are just items that have caught major attention, some of which may potentially have OSINT aspects down the road. A lot of them are context setting to understand the background for information as it develops. A lot of these we have talked about in past spaces. So the first item, up in the nest, tweet by Elizabeth Gosselin Mallow, who's a defense journalist, is following up on this proposal for Rheinmetall to build a plant in Ukraine that would produce the Panther, the newest proposed model of tank, and up to 400 of them annually. And so the question in her article is that a realistic plan? And just to summarize the article, there are quite a number of unknowns, whether it would be a full manufacturing plant versus whether it would simply be assembly. The strong suggestion is that it is not, it would take some years to manufacture, or excuse me, some years to construct such a plant. And the suggestion is that the construction of the plant may not even begin until the war is over, although that's not certain either. It notes that Ukraine's own need for production of tanks, sort of on a replacement basis, is maybe on the order of 40 or 50 a year, as opposed to 400. And so how the need to be able to build 400 comes up, begs the question, what other countries might that level of production support in the region? So there are several interesting questions asked in that article, not all of which are answered. But we did bring it up in a space maybe 2 weeks ago, suggesting it sounded pretty unrealistic. And we were debating, some of the politics of Rheinmetall and Germany, and, whether they were trying to potentially, win Ukrainian favor by indicating investment versus how committed are they. Those questions are not fully answered, but the fact they're proceeding with it and apparently putting out slowly but surely more detail suggests they are in fact serious about it. And by the way, Random has begun to put some tweets backing up his notes about the developments in Israel up in the nest, so keep an eye there so you can see his sources. And again, if any of these items inspire you, please feel free to come up, whether it be a comment or a question. Exit, go ahead.
It just strikes me that I know in the Tochnyi space they were talking about Alexander, whose name I won't pretend to discuss or pronounce, sorry, who used to run the railway system in Ukraine. He's now been promoted to a governmental ministry that kind of deals with ammo production and defense production and other really important industries. And it strikes me that that Rheinmetall deal would fall under his purview, and he might be one to watch for more updates on that.
That's a great point. I think his name is Kamishin, if I'm not mistaken. But
Kamishin.
Yeah, he's been appointed as the, I think, the Minister of Strategic Industries. And interestingly, to see competent managers being promoted, Mikhailo Fedorov, I believe, who is the Minister of Digital Infrastructure, who has, to an outside observer, is doing a terrific job, has now been promoted, I believe, to Deputy Prime Minister. So it's nice to see them promoting great leaders. The next item from the news, and these items are further back in the nest because we're getting sort of breaking updates on the Israeli situation right at the front, but you'll have to look back 5 or 6 now. There was a discussion about deployment of Russian nuclear weapons within Belarus. I wanted to highlight 2 things on that subject. One is, my understanding is the Russians have not said that they specifically nuclear weapons, but that they have said 2 things. One is they would provide Belarus, or they would deploy within Belarus Iskander systems that are capable of being nuclear armed, and at the same time that they're constructing a depot or storage site potentially for nuclear arms, which is a little bit different than saying they will definitely be deployed there. And the particular tweet that I've decided to put up is one by Pavel Podvig, who is a Russian nuclear arms expert, and he's noting that it's not clear whether this nuclear storage site is under construction, but he hopes that OSINT people will find it quickly, and that the timeline presented in the announcement of potential deployment by July seems unlikely if it's not already under construction, meaning that there may be potential for people to start scouring satellite imagery of bases around Belarus to try to find a big construction project that would indicate where the storage will be. So if you happen to be into geolocation or image intelligence, that might be one subject you could turn your attention to. I think there's already been plenty of discussion about deployment of nuclear weapons to Belarus, so I won't belabor it, but if anybody has seen any sort of nuance on that front in the last few days, feel free to come up and mention it to us. Another item that we've discussed in the past space relates to the pressing of war crimes charges against Vladimir Putin and at least one other Russian leader or member of the Russian government. And interestingly, one wrinkle coming from that, there was a report a little over a week ago that the United States may be withholding some information that would be evidence of war crimes from Ukraine out of concern because the United States has not ratified the treaties that would make it subject to the International Criminal Court. But now, this is the development, and I'll move it to the front of the nest, which will just take a moment to populate because it's now so far back. But it should appear in the front in just a moment. It's a tweet by Charlie Savage, I believe of the New York Times, who is noting that a bipartisan group of senators, including Dick Durbin and Lindsey Graham, have sent a letter to Biden urging him to share that intelligence. So that's an interesting political development, which I think is a just development. I'm not I'm a Canadian and not an American citizen, but it sounds like a very reasonable approach to me. hopefully they find success with it. And I'll be keeping an eye on whether they have any luck. Related to that is I have been sort of keeping track after the application of war crimes charges of the number of countries who have said they will or they will not arrest Vladimir Putin if he travels to their country. And so far, the count is that Germany, Ireland, and South Africa have definitely come out and said they would arrest Putin. We can add to that now Austria. That tweet should now be at the front of the nest, I hope. And the one country that had come out and said they definitively would not arrest Putin was Hungary. So I'm going to keep an eye on countries as they come down on those statements. And of course, just as a reminder, the U.S. once again opted to kind of dodge on the question, saying it's unlikely Putin would travel to the United States. Exit, go ahead.
That's really interesting that South Africa specifically came out and said that, considering they've been cooperating on a military front with Russia recently and China. And it just occurs to me that that's really interesting. But I saw Andrew's hand go up, so maybe he has a comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew. Yep.
I just want to say that Armenia, I believe, also said that they would arrest Putin.
Oh, thanks for that. I hadn't seen that. I'll do a search afterward for it so that I...
Yeah, Austria came out as well. When it came to arresting Putin as well, they said I think that just came out in the last couple hours or so.
Yeah, I think it did this morning. That was the particular tweet that I was sharing. And to Exit's point about South Africa, what South Africa did was participate in naval exercises with China and Russia, which is a degree of cooperation as well. There was a Russian roll-on, roll-off ship, which is specialized for the movement of military equipment, docked at a South African military base, and it was either late November or December. And there was quite a bit of controversy because it sort of docked in the middle of the night, loaded something, and then took off. But as far as I know, even though opposition politicians came out and demanded to be informed of what was going on, I'm not aware of any public answer about South Africa's engagement there. So I agree that it's interesting they came out and made that statement, particularly because one of the next foreign trips that Putin was set to take was to South Africa in, I believe it was June, for the BRICS summit. So it sounds like he'll have to cancel his plans there. Okay. Oh, and the last point, which I think I moved up to the front of the nest, I'm just double checking it now, was a new initiative with regard to Russian assets in the United Kingdom. Yeah, it's the second item in the front of the nest. It's the tweet by Dionys Senusa, but it's him covering and retweeting the Politico article, noting that there is now a plan proposed in the European Union to take the frozen Russian assets and invest them and use the interest as it accrues on the 200 plus billion that is held in Europe out of the total 300 billion that is frozen by allies of Ukraine, to take interest on that 200 billion and start directing the interest to Ukraine for the purposes of reconstruction. And so I'm hopeful that initiatives like that meet some success. Ultimately, I think it would be just if legal hurdles can be overcome so that the 300 billion that's frozen can be seized. But short of that, starting by using the capital to productively produce interest and then direct it to Ukraine is a good start. Okay, I'm going to update the nest with a couple of more developments. One of which will appear in just a moment, is from almost a week ago, but it is observations from satellite imagery that it appears that Russian forces in Belarus that were being tracked closely, out of concern that a buildup there may indicate Belarusian direct involvement in the war. The Russian forces in Belarus appear to be being drawn down, so their number there is decreasing, which is a good sign because it alleviates some of the concern about Belarus getting directly involved. Of course, it means that we need to track where those Russians are transferred to. Andrew spoke earlier to the fact that troops are being transferred to the Avdiivka area without being certain where they're being drawn from. I'm not proposing they necessarily be those troops leaving Belarus, but that's the sort of rotation that is possible. There was also a significant rotation of troops around Nova Kakhovka last week that briefly led to Ukraine putting out a statement that Russian troops had withdrawn, but apparently it was just such a significant rotation that there was some confusion about what they were actually doing, and Ukraine clarified that it was just a rotation. So the Belarusian drawdown is one. Another item that didn't seem to get a lot of attention, this was 4 days ago. It's up in the nest. It's a tweet by Radio Free Europe. It's about a Russian partisan group that has claimed responsibility for starting a fire at an FSB compound in Rostov-on-Don, which is one of the Russian regions bordering Ukraine. Obviously, an attack on an FSB facility would be particularly risky, in that several people were injured as well. Apparently, it's credit for it is being claimed by a group calling themselves Chyorny Most, which is for Black Brigade. That I had only ever seen this one reference to this claim, so I thought I would bring it to the group's attention. I haven't taken the time to do any research into what the Black Brigade is or how significant it might be, but if anybody knows any more about it, please feel free to come up and let us know. Otherwise, you may be interested in going away to do a little bit more research on what that group is, and whether it may be a player in future partisan attacks. One more item, second from the left in the nest. Again, it's by Dionis Senysa. There's an article at the bottom from a Ukrainian news site that he is just covering here, but it was a statement that was made by a Ukrainian government spokesperson who had said they believed that the Russians may be shifting the targeting of their missile and drone attacks. We've discussed previously that focus has been on the Ukrainian energy system. With spring approaching, there were some interesting articles written with the opinion that that campaign had failed. And we discussed it in our spaces previously. Now this Ukrainian government official is saying they believe that the Russians have actually changed their strategy specifically, and that they may now be attacking oil and sort of oil product distribution points as opposed to electrical points. Beyond that one statement, I haven't seen evidence of that in terms of measurable less strikes against transformers, more strikes against oil points. But I'm sure there are people here who are paying close attention who might be able to follow that and confirm it in the coming days. And I appreciate that Random is continuing to put some sources in the nest. As I take a moment to grab a couple of more items for conversation, Random, did you want to take a moment just to describe some of the things you're finding and putting up there?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you guys a rundown. First thing in the nest is from Trey Yanks to Fox. Basically, Israeli protesters have been flooding into Tel Aviv. A lot of what's been going on is they're starting to have protesters converge on both the residence of the prime minister, in this case, Bibi Netanyahu, and on the Knesset that are actively protesting. They've had to use water cannons to try and keep them out of the prime minister's house. I know there's been some recent reports by some OSINT users that they actually tried to get into Netanyahu's house from a couple hours ago. Another thing is hospitals, universities, and labor workers announced that they will be having a strike in response to the sacking of the Israeli defense minister. That is what started off this whole series of new protests that were already ongoing in regards to Netanyahu's push for changing the judiciary in Israel. There have been protests ongoing, but that is the thing that really set it off tonight was the sacking of the Israeli defense minister. As well in the nest, there is also a couple of places where there is basically a massive political crisis. There's calls for the justice minister to either pull back the legislation. Multiple political groups and opposition parties have been trying to get this bill that they've been trying to pass pulled. The former IDF deputy chief of staff called on all the representatives in Israeli embassies to resign immediately and not to support the government. Also, former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett came out and said that Israel is in its greatest danger since the Yom Kippur War. And there have been major cracks forming in the party that put Bibi in office. That was also Bennett's party. They are definitely fractures coming throughout the government and the Knesset. There are even accusations spread by Benjamin Netanyahu's son against the U.S. government, and the Biden administration came out and rejected those as completely false over the fact that basically the accusations that the United States was somehow funding these anti-judicial law protests that had been going on. Obviously, there has been some friction with Bibi as the leader of Israel with the U.S., but that goes back to other issues. Obviously, Bibi Netanyahu coming back into power after the previous administration has caused a noticeable rift within the Israeli politics domestically, and there's a lot that plays into that I am not completely up to speed on, but I do know that they are really pushing to try and oust Bibi at this point. There's been numerous videos of protests, basically where protesters are chanting to fire Netanyahu or get him out of the way. And there's talk about stuff going on to try and use the justice minister as a possible foil or scapegoat in this situation. So that's what I got for now. Other than that, I could go into the news from the Global South Asia Pacific region, but Michael Bond, I'm sure you've got something going.
I do. I mean, those are, shocking developments in Israel. I know it's been a while in building up, but thank you for keeping an eye on it. If you see anything else develop, feel free to put it in the nest. Okay, a few more developments from Europe, most of which is in connection with the war in Ukraine. And I had discussed a few of these with Exit. So if any of these strike you as interesting, feel free to let me know which you might like to speak to. Just as a quick summary, the first item in the nest caught, I don't know if it went exactly viral, but it caught a lot of attention in that the Norwegian arms manufacturer has said that they're unable to scale up as quickly as they'd like to because the power they need for their plant has been promised to a data center owned by TikTok, which is a pretty crazy claim. Exit, go ahead.
So the last year, I know it was, I was part of building a new building, and I know specifically in the place that I live, power to new areas is governed by a privately held company, and it takes an extensive amount of time. Like we were 8 months from the time that we paid the deposit on getting power to that new place. And it sounds like similarly, this particular ammo production facility, their area just doesn't have enough power actually run to the place that they are, and that for whatever reason, the TikTok owned server farm essentially has signed a deal to basically take over more of the power. And it raises the question that should governments be taking more control of industries like power generation and power supply, because they have more of a defense, like a national security interest to them when it comes to something like this. But also, like longer term, if TikTok is something that governments are specifically saying, hey, we don't even want this on your phone if you're a government employee, then why are we allowing companies like that to actually put server farms up and approving them with all of the different regulations that they surely have to walk through in order to have a new production facility? Why are we approving them to actually go through and have these server farms in countries that they're not even allowed to be on the phones? It kind of points to that there's a big discrepancy between what we see in national security interest versus what we see in the industrial side of a government and the way that they approve new projects.
I'm not sure whether this particular article speaks to it or not, but I do know that Norway and its neighboring countries in the region have become favorites for the construction of server farms, both because of their normally cool temperatures, which allow more economical cooling of the server farms, which generate a lot of heat. But also, I understand because Norway has so much electricity that it generates from hydropower, and it has an abundance of natural gas as well, that a lot of these tech companies that want to be giving statistics on the type of electricity that drives their servers for the purposes of reports on carbon consumption, they base themselves in Norway. And so, aside from the specific role of TikTok, I'd imagine the government might be a little bit reluctant to take power away from a server center because they would like to promote the continued growth of the server industry in the country. And I'm not sure how much that was counterbalanced by the fact that it's specifically TikTok. Okay. The next item is one that it got a fair bit of attention, but it is so significant it may not even have received attention that it merits, which is that the heads of the air forces of Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway have signed an agreement to operate their jets as a combined force, which has been noted by several observers as a major step, right? The combining air forces, gives up a degree of autonomy over the operation of that force, but also it leads to closer military integration in the region as a whole. So I think this is a major change, and it's been noted for its potential to act as a counterbalance to potential Russian threat in the region. It will be interesting to see how much this contributes to standardization of the equipment or the potential for joint purchases. Exit, go ahead.
I just wondered, for those of you out there who have more military experience than me, what that would change fundamentally for how Russia operates in and around those countries, because they obviously are known to run incursions into each of those countries, and I'm wondering if this would change anything. It sounds similar to kind of the NORAD setup, but I don't know if that actually changes how Russia will act in this case.
Well, it's interesting. They have gone ahead with this integration, including Finland and Sweden, even though a session to NATO has not been completed, although I think Finnish accession is anticipated in the next day or two. But Swedish sounds like it may be a month or more off for political reasons. And this also comes following the recent agreement between Finland and the United States to engage in joint surveillance patrols over Finnish airspace, which is a major development in itself. So there's a lot happening up there. Wolverine, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, so as far as that goes, yeah, like you're saying, it is kind of like NORAD in a way. And even with NORAD and us sending up F-22s, the Russians still play their game, so they're probably not going to stop them. But I'm not sure. I'd have to look, if somebody happens to know like the actual distances, because I know like when the Russian bombers come over our way, they're still over international airspace. It just depends on the ADIZ and how far they're coming in. Now, I'm not exactly sure what those countries have set up as far as that goes, but the only thing you don't have to have all the same aircraft across the board with them. You just have to be able to have the aircraft communicate with each other and to be able to operate with each other. That's why we do a lot of exercises with all the different countries in the region. And, that's why we can send out, whether it be Marine F-35Bs, F-22s, or B-52s. We also have the same working communications, and we all know what we can do. So that allows us to work with all the different countries in order to maintain that. The other thing it kind of does is it actually will put like less, in a way, it'll kind of put like less wear and tear on aircraft in a way, because, instead of 3 different countries sending up aircraft to cover the same area, you have one country at a time. Let's say they do a 30-day rotation example, right? So that's less time that one specific country's aircraft may have to spend up there, which may actually give the aircraft from that country more time to actually do different types of training and stuff like that. But like I said, interoperability, once they've done it, I don't know if Sweden and whoever you said, I know it was Finland and Denmark, and who else was it? I didn't hear the other countries.
It's basically all the Scandinavian countries. It's
okay.
Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. So all the Vikings.
Yeah. So what'll happen? So it'll help them with that aspect also, but it also helps with the aspect of, if they want to sit there and, let's say, I know Norway has F-18s. Well, F-18s can actually use, if Denmark has F-16s, there's a lot of munitions that can actually be used between both of those aircraft. Sweden is operating the Viggens. So that's one I'm not totally sure about. They may have to sit there, like if something did happen, they may want to try and sit there and do something where they're able to fire the same types of munitions as the other countries are. And then Finland, I don't remember what aircraft they're flying, but kind of the same thing, and if they haven't been doing any kind of joint training, now would be a good time to actually do some of that. But Denmark and Norway have already been doing joint training with US and NATO. So I could see them all getting together and, basically applying the NATO standards to Sweden, and then just finding out their capability and what their aircraft can do.
Finns use FA-18s and F-35s, Wolverine, so they're all in the same boat.
Okay, yeah, then that makes it a little bit easier.
One thing I forgot to mention in reviewing what's happening in that region is also Ukraine recently put in a formal request to Finland to see if they would donate some Hornets. Who knows how this factors into the coordination of a joint force. I believe it was ID10T, and then we'll go to John. So ID10T first.
Yeah, Wolverine nailed it. Sounds like a pact of information and asset sharing, so they can collaborate their capabilities. And I'll add to that, it's also a de facto NATO entry for countries that are in that pact that are not part of NATO. If they are engaged, they are engaging also NATO aircraft. So you kind of get you get all the positives, if you will.
That's a great point. So it sounds it's great that they have gotten their politics to a place where, I mean, it's unfortunate that it may have been inspired by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's great that they've gotten to a point where they can cooperate at that level. John, go ahead.
Yeah, so interoperability is a great point that Wolverine made. All three countries, well, obviously Denmark is part of NATO, but all three of the northern Nordic countries have been interoperable with NATO assets for a very long time. They've been, someone mentioned de facto part of NATO. They've basically been a de facto part of NATO for a while now. And the Finns have been cross-training and have done joint drills with NATO. The past recent spat of northern ones, I believe, if I'm correct, they had Marines up there. You know, and I believe a couple striker brigades doing some wilderness training with the Finns because they're like the best at that. Everyone knows that. Russia will never forget that. So yeah, so interoperability is actually already there, which is great. And you hit it right on the nail, Wolverine, talking about wear and tear on aircraft and how this kind of eases the strain on each of their capabilities. So the one thing I would add, though, is that it'll become easier for them as they become even more. So obviously they're not completely interoperable. Like complete interoperability obviously would be being paid for, like being part of the same unit, actually, right? So, but as they become more, they're able to meld certain communication systems and other things like that, and marry these together to potentiate their capabilities. They'll be able to track Russian aircraft way better, and then maybe even connect with other nations in the area, which I think they're already doing. So I don't think it really extends their capability much, but it's more so a statement to Russia that, like, you're not really going to bully us, because historically the three Nordic nations and have kind of like banded together, even though sometimes they may differ on certain issues, but they have always banded together on one thing, and that's always been defense against Russian aggression. So it's great to see this, them that, you know, saying it out loud, you know. Arguably, the Finns have always said it out loud, though.
Great points. Okay. Just FYI, we have maybe 15 or 20 minutes left. As usual, we may not cover all the material that I prepared, but that's on me for being over-prepared. The next couple of items, sometimes a topic comes up where there are several interesting developments, and it's the sort of thing we just don't touch on often enough. But they're, you know, because they're in the same field, I think, oh, wow, it's a great theme. And one of those for this week is developments in espionage, particularly counter-Russian espionage. And so, again, these items are up in the nest. The first of which is there is a man who is believed to be a Russian spy, who was arrested in, I can't remember which Nordic country it was off the top of my head, but he had built a cover identity as a Brazilian, and apparently had been developing that cover identity for about 10 years and built up an academic reputation, and then I believe was working as an academic doing sort of consulting work in whichever Nordic, like a military think tank. And the way that it's developed is that after his arrest, rather than the Russians, acknowledging him as an intelligence agent and then trying to swap him or, rejecting and saying it's all made up, none of it's true, they took a different tack, which is instead to make up false charges against him for drug possession in Russia. and to say, oh, well, actually, we want him to be put on trial for crimes here, which I don't know that it's completely novel, but a lot, it was unexpected. And apparently, investigation suggests that those charges had been laid against somebody else, and they were altered to apparently apply to this individual and to request extradition in the hope that the country that is holding him would sort of their procedures would hold them captive, and they would say, well, I guess we have to extradite him back to Russia, which I guess, if nothing else is gutsy. But now, to counter that, the United States has released an indictment against him. And so the first thread in the nest notes that this indictment contains a lot of very interesting details about, the style of operation of this spy in terms of building his cover identity, because it seems like there was a huge amount of investment that went into it, being a decade of work. And other interesting evidence about, technique of dead drops where he would be leaving comms equipment to, exchange data, and other interesting spy techniques. So you might enjoy that thread. After that indictment dropped, the next tweet in the nest by Christo Grozev, who is the founder of Bellingcat, they did some work with the info revealed in the indictment, and they made a further discovery that apparently the U.S. authorities have not made, or they haven't acknowledged anyway. And they went and Bellingcat went away and did some research and realized that somebody using this person's cover identity apparently went to Russia for medical treatment. And because Russia has extremely poor data privacy, data management, they were able to purchase records of medical tests in Russia for the relevant window. And by cross-referencing it with travel, and I guess Bellingcat has assembled lists of names that are other known cover names of Russian agents. They identified the use of another cover name on a medical test at the time that this individual went to Russia for medical tests. And so essentially what Bellingcat seems to have revealed is that he was using this specific cover name, because they didn't know who it was assigned to. They only knew it was a cover. So that's, again, interesting field work. It's not the sort of thing that we're going to do all that readily, because we're probably not going to go out and bribe people in Russia to reveal medical tests too often, but Bellingcat is out there and doing it. Two more items on the espionage front. The fourth item back in the nest is an article by The Guardian, which is just a follow-up on a couple who have been arrested as Russian spies in Slovenia. Again, their arrest occurred a few months ago, just as the spy who had the Brazilian cover identity. But it's just a profile of their work, in that it took some months for the investigative journalists to do their digging. So there are details there that you might like. Finally, on the espionage front, it's a tweet. It's by Language Learner, who's a friend of the space, but he's just covering or highlighting new work by Oliver Alexander that's published on Oliver's Substack. We've spoken to Oliver's work investigating the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. In particular, he has been out there debunking the arguments put forward by the well-known journalist Seymour Hersh, who appears not to have put a whole lot of effort into his investigations. And so there have been so many twists and turns in this story, it's hard to get into it in detail. But even after Hersh made his accusations that the Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed in a joint U.S.-Norwegian operation, that there were lots of data points that Oliver brought up that were inconsistent with that that story, and most people have dismissed it as a viable explanation. Following that, investigations were published in the German newspaper Die Zeit and I believe the New York Times, suggesting that it may have been an operation conducted using a private sailboat and a group that rented it in the week prior to the attack, who apparently rented it with Ukrainian IDs, the suggestion being that it may have been a non-government group that was doing it potentially with pro-Ukrainian associations, but that certainly has not been proven. That investigation proceeded, and the boat is based in Germany. The name of that ship, or I'm not sure if it's a ship or a boat, to be honest, is the Andromeda, and it was searched, and there's ongoing investigation there, I understand, in Germany. But Oliver has, with his dogged determination, continued looking at other alternatives. I've previously in this space discussed past publication. He put up about the possibility that it may have been an internal weakness of the pipeline, in that when the pipeline was constructed, the ship used for construction purposes was not, there was concern that it was not up to the task, and that there was a significant storm when the ship was in the region where the initial breach of the pipeline occurred. So that's a theory he's looked at. Again, not proven. And this is his latest, which is looking at a number of Russian military ships that apparently were in that same region in the week before the blast. And I haven't read the entire investigation yet because it only dropped yesterday. But he goes into the fact that Russia was saying there was a very big naval exercise in the region at the time, and all of these ships were dedicated to that naval exercise. But Oliver is saying, contemporaneous press releases by the Russian Navy there were several ships in the region that were not noted as being involved in the exercise. And so the question is, well, why were they there then? And that's what Oliver is now looking at. So you might find that enlightening. John, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, it's great you're highlighting the intelligence, specifically, the espionage part of it, part of the war, ongoing war, and just the tensions in Europe. I'd also just add a last intelligence update. If you guys all remember that Germany was noted as being extremely weak-skinned or susceptible to Russian. I'm losing the term. Sorry about this. A Russian basically being infiltrated by Russians, FSB, and they had this one FSB officer who they expelled for trying to gain HIMARS, the locations and the coordinates for HIMARS batteries. And apparently this was like discovered about a month ago, I believe, in the German intelligence agency. They had like a mole. And I just seen, I believe, late yesterday that Germany is trying to move to fix a bunch of holes that they've now uncovered in their intelligence apparatus. I think historically, though, Germany has always been kind of a weak intelligence capability-wise, kind of a weak power in that regard. And so I think it's interesting that Der Spiegel is the one who kind of is propagating this next almost rendition of the story, of the Seymour Hersh story. So I would just note that Germany has heavy amounts of Russian infiltration when it comes to their intelligence apparatus. So some of the stuff coming out of Germany may not be so, and then you highlighted that too as well, may not be all that reliable. Evidence of that fact is that the United States and other NATO nations they announced, and this is kind of old news, most of you probably already heard this, but they announced that they would ratchet down their intelligence sharing with the German intelligence agencies and their military because of the mole and other holes that they found in their intelligence apparatus.
I had not heard about the reduction in intelligence sharing. That's interesting. I'll have to go and look that up.
I did find a tweet from Michael Weiss from the retweeting that Der Spiegel article from last month. So that was back in February of this year. So that's up in the nest.
Oh, thank you. And there are other vulnerabilities in the European system that aren't perhaps explicit espionage, but it was also covered this week that the head of a European money laundering agency, I believe the name of the agency is Moneyval, was in fact the son of a Russian senior officer, I think potentially a general, I think maybe a general in one of the Russian intelligence branches. And so that caused a lot of concern for obvious reasons. And my understanding is the way that was resolved is that that gentleman, head of the money laundering agency, anti-money laundering agency, opted to resign. So, the concerns are not just people doing it discreetly, but the ties that are wide open as well. ID10T, go ahead.
Well, this doesn't have, while it may not have direct relation to the story at hand, just a quick history on espionage and gentleman agreements. Throughout the Cold War and since then, there has been an unwritten gentleman's agreement where the intelligence officer operating within a foreign state was not often arrested and charged. The local nationals, for example, if a Russian intelligence officer was over here and colluded with Americans to obtain information, those Americans would be charged. And the intelligence officer would be picked up and deported off to Russia. It was now you'll find stories where heinous and very damaging situations or closed room negotiations failed of some sort, and someone was charged with espionage from a foreign nation. But that was kind of a long-standing gentleman's agreement. Now, some stories have been coming up recently, back in May, where we actually arrested and charged Chinese intelligence officers, and there's offices in China that have been raided by the CCP. And this is just something to keep an eye on, that what I like to refer to as cracks in the diplomacy dike. All indications that the diplomacy dike and gentlemen's agreements, that is being compromised, and things are being handled differently now.
Yeah, Michael, I could go down the rabbit hole with China news this week, but I know we're limited on time.
Yes, and so thank you very much, ID10T. To that point, we'll go maybe 5 more minutes. We'll get to the geolocation challenge. So we are trying to slowly incorporate some instruction, entertainment into the space in the form of geo puzzles, so you can practice some skills if you like. And we'll hear from the person who was fastest at solving the puzzles in just a moment. As I over-prepared, I keep moving the issue of Chinese engagement or Chinese influence in the war from session to session without ever getting to it. And given that the visit of Xi to Moscow was on Tuesday of this week, Monday, Tuesday, I don't want it to get too old. I won't go into it in detail, but I will note that I put my resources that I have found interesting in the nest, and the overview is just to say there are 3 tweets there, and it includes everything from Um, China potentially waking up to the fact that Russia may lose the war, the fact that when the Brazilian president attended and visited China this week, they proposed the concept of a peace club to kind of riff on China's rather vague peace plan that it released perhaps 3 weeks ago. China's increasing engagement in kind of secondary issues, being the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Of course, with Iran supplying weapons to Russia, it gets to be a complicated network. Other items in those tweets include the visit of the Japanese Prime Minister to Kiev at the same time that she was in Moscow, and the political implications of that. The supply of some rifles and drone parts from China to Ukraine. I don't have a link to it, but just this week, I think just yesterday, Biden came out and said he doesn't see that China has been providing substantive lethal aid to Russia yet, even though they are still concerned about the potential for that. There had been reports that she would hold a telephone call with Zelensky after his visit to Moscow, but I don't believe that ever happened. If anybody listening wants to correct me, I don't think they ever had a call, which is maybe it wasn't all that promising in the first place, but it suggests that China is not particularly interested in an engagement with Ukraine. And then finally, there were some resources in the last of the tweets on China about the value to Russia of China's visit. And included in there, for example, is a list of all of the deals that were actually signed. But then the fact that the visit itself was disappointing because what Russia had hoped for in terms of commitment and specific deals was not achieved. Specifically, the Power of Siberia pipeline, the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, that would need to be built in order to transit gas from some of the major Russian gas fields to China. It would take years to build, and the Russians had been giving every indication that a deal on that pipeline was imminent, and nothing was signed during the visit, which is being interpreted as a failure of Russian diplomacy on that front. So unfortunately, I can't speak to it at more length than I just did, but if you're interested in those things, all of those resources are in that big thread that I put out each week of speaking points. So check that out. Okay, so we'll wrap up with the Geo puzzle. I'll hand it over to Exit and our winner from this week, Carolyn, to describe last week's puzzle and this week's puzzle.
Thank you. So up in the nest, you'll find the second tweet back is actually the tweet from last week, from Thursday, that had the geolocation. And so there's 3 separate things that you were geolocating. You were finding the countries for 2 postcards that each had 4 pictures. And then there was a 1-picture tweet that you were looking for the location for. And Carolyn solved those. And so I asked her to come speak about one of the things that she solved and tell us how she did it, because there's probably a lot of you in the space that are kind of new to how that works and might appreciate some tips on that. Carolyn, you told me that Tunisia was a hard one. Do you want to tell me how you solved it?
Yeah, well, I kind of want to start by just saying that I do this for fun. So there's really no particular approach or method that I use. And, when you first look at these, sometimes you think there's absolutely nothing to work with, and sometimes it's almost like there's too much. So in this particular one, there's a lot in the picture to look at. There's an unusual tree with lots of branches. There's a white building with green windows. There's a sign that I was able to zoom in on that I don't know the correct pronunciation, but it's spelled SONEDE. That turned out to be a water utility in Tunisia. So that was my first strong clue. After that, I started to think, how am I ever going to find this? I tried Googling different locations for the water utilities, but as it turns out, the sign kind of looks like it's pointing to the left, but it's actually going straight down the street. So in the end, that didn't help me. I saw the bike rack, the particular attire the gentleman was wearing. I looked at the sidewalk material. I looked at the bike rack. I said that it's on the corner. I looked that it was on the corner. So those were the things that I noticed the most at first. And I just sort of poked around looking and I didn't get anywhere. I think the tree was a big piece of looking because a lot of the streets in Tunisia, and I focused mostly in Tunis, it wasn't there, but a lot of the streets don't have trees or don't have that type of tree, so that eliminated a lot. And then, I just was frustrated, so I would drop in and take a look at different places. And then I caught on to something, which was, one, I didn't think it was in a big city. And the other thing was the shadows on the sidewalk, which might be obvious to some people at first, but that's kind of what's fun about doing this is sometimes the most obvious things you never see, and then the least obvious jumps out. Anyway, that was a huge help because then I could go down to the map and immediately knew I needed to look on a shady side of the street and I had to find a street with those trees. And, it took a while, but that was pretty much how I found this particular spot. It's interesting because when I approached this spot, via the little Google Peg Man, if you're on the corner, I don't know who's looking at the picture, but if you're on the corner where the sunny part of the street is and you come up the street, there are probably 20 bicycles in the bike rack. So it's kind of interesting that this perspective only shows the gentleman and the single bike. But that was how I found it. And it was a lot of fun. And I think that I don't have any particular skills. I really just do it for fun. So it's something that anybody can do. And I'm sure that if anybody else got this, they did it completely differently than I did. And I think that's a lot of what's fun about it.
That's awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. And to her point, going forward, if you do solve one of the riddles, because this week or Sunday's topic, it's up in the nest, it's the very first one, is actually a riddle to be solved, and you're looking for a very specific place. And if you do solve it, I would invite you to come up and tell us how you did it on Thursday, because what I've learned from doing these over the years is that everybody does have a very different experience of how they do it. And sometimes people find them in ways you really didn't expect at all, and it helps all of us learn a new, different tactic each time. But thank you so much for coming and telling us, Carolyn.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you to you both. And having been a veteran of Exit's series of geolocation spaces, puzzle spaces several months ago, this newest one that's riddle based, you're looking for a specific, location or landmark. Did you want that in GPS coordinates?
So either you can send a lat long, or if you want to do it the really easy way, when you find it on Google Earth, there's usually a Google Share link that you can copy there and just DM that to me, and it'll be easy to pull up.
Okay. And we'll look forward to somebody who solves it creatively coming to describe how they did it in the next space. Random, go ahead.
Okay, just as one final quick update, it seems like the entire nation of Israel will be going on strike tomorrow due to this situation. Just as my final update, the main union in Israel got together and voted. So all the major business unions and the major groups got together, voted for a strike. It sounds like local mayors and municipalities are going to engage in hunger strikes. And it also sounds like the major universities, so in addition to the hospitals and other businesses, are also going on strike tomorrow. So right now it seems like then Yahoo is starting to backtrack a little bit from what it sounds like, according to some sources. I will try and put that or retweet that because I know we're running out of time. But yeah, it sounds like Israel's going on strike. And I know we still have Andrew in the space, and so I think it's important to ask this crucial question for Mr. Bond because we never get to it. But just because of Andrew's prior experience, I have to ask, how will the loss of Edwin Diaz affect Michael Bond's fantasy team going into the season, Andrew?
It's a catastrophe.
Confirmed, 100%. For those who don't know, Andrew has a past as a baseball analyst, and so that adds a little bit of color to the knowledge of our guests. To Random's point about the ongoing events in Israel, reminder that Aaron, who spoke with us earlier, is holding space tonight at 10. I think the link to his thread, the link to his space is still in the nest. Good luck finding it, given how full the nest is right now, but it's up there. It strikes me that there might be space for a continuation series of discussions between now and 10 p.m. If anybody wants to hold one of those, I'm going to say concluding remarks for about a minute. If you want to come up to say, yeah, I'm going to hold it, follow me, and it'll open in a minute. You have a minute to do that. Otherwise, the crowd will disperse. Yeah, everybody, thank you very much for joining me tonight. I think it was a good conversation. Great thanks to Andrew for coming with his updates. Please do follow Andrew. The link to his YouTube is also in the nest, where he does his regular presentations. Thanks to all of the speakers. I had my sort of pitch around the middle, trying to encourage people to think about what is OSINT, how do you engage with the process? Are you a consumer of the information, which is great, that builds the infrastructure in people's minds so they're better informed down the road. If you want to move beyond that and contribute, but you don't have any special expertise in sort of the traditional OSINT areas, building kind of a support network I think is valuable as well. So if that if that means you, feel free to shoot me a DM, and I'll let you know as we build out that concept. So our next space, that reminds me, I'll drop it in the nest, so it's up there for 30 seconds in case you guys want to set reminders. It will be on Thursday night. It should populate up there in just a moment. Thursday night, 9 p.m. Similar to this, hopefully we'll have a speaker that will maybe interview at a little bit more length. Great thanks to my co-hosts, Exit and Random, without whom it would be very hard to do this work. I'd encourage you to check out the accounts of most of the speakers we had up tonight and give them a follow. All right, guys, hopefully we will see you on Thursday. Good night.